think we've got critical mass. We'll get started. Thank you for being here. I realize you have many options of things to do today. Good news is it's all being recorded, so you can watch whichever session you're not in later at another time, which I look forward to. Somebody just told me I'm footnoted in one of them that I'm not going to be in one. Don't say mean things. So let me just do a quick introduction of this amazing panel we have today. I'm sorry, I'm going to do them a little out of order. So Jim Lewis, is currently focusing on conflict, emerging technology, and international security at the Center for European Policy Analysis. His writing and research focuses on how innovation changes global competition, technology reshapes society, and state power. Jim previously served as a U.S. diplomat and a member of the Senior Executive Service with it spanned national security, technology, transfer and export control, encryption, internet security, and international negotiations. Hey, your bio's long, man. He has also been an advisor with a multilateral setting, serving as a senior advisor, multiple UN groups of government experts on information security, which are all central to the evolution of international cyber norms and status and frameworks that we're working with today. Jim has been a senior advisor and a leader at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he directed the major programs, commissions, and produced foundation work on cybersecurity strategy, technology, competition, national power, and he is affiliated with the U.S. Naval Academy cybersecurity community as a visiting professor and reflects on ongoing roles translating strategic issues into operational defense audiences. So you all should be very impressed that you're at the right place. Forget what those other groups are talking about. Rob Nake is the CEO of TPO Group. He is a cybersecurity strategist that focuses on government and company organized budget and government cybersecurity risks. He currently leads the TPO Group, advising organizations on cybersecurity strategy and governance. He served as the first Deputy National Cyber Director of the Office of National Cybersecurity at the White House, where he helped stand up the organization and led the work tied to national cyber strategy and federal cyber budget priorities, which we all know we're going to get into that in a bit. We've been having some issues with our cyber budget. Earlier, he served as the Director of Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council, responsible for developing presidential cyber policy and federal processes, incident response, and vulnerability management. In addition to running CPO Group, he serves as a venture partner and strategic advisor in the investment and advisory ecosystem, including Paladin Capital Group, and has advised multiple cybersecurity firms in his advisory capacity. Camille, who's sitting right next to me. Camille Stewart Gloucester is a strategist, an attorney, and an executive whose career bridges cybersecurity, emerging technology, national security, and technology governance. She is the founder and CEO of, do you call it CAS or CAS?
I hear it both ways.
Which do you prefer?
CAS.
Okay, CAS, all right. From now on, CAS Strategies, advising on cyber and emerging technology, resilience, and policy. She served as the first Deputy National Cyber Director for Technology and Ecosystem Security at the White House, advising on technology security, supply chain integrity, emerging technologies, and cyber workforce development. Her portfolio often is described as spanning technology to ecosystem and operational national initiatives, connecting policy design and implementing across government industries. In addition to her government leadership, she held senior roles at Google, including product and security strategy and security policy, and has been affiliated with major professional service organizations. Michael Daniels, who I've now had the luck to be with 2 weeks in a row for several things. President and CEO of Cyber Threat Alliance, CTA. Michael leads the Cyber Threat Alliance, a nonprofit membership organization focused on improving cybersecurity outcomes through trusted, actionable threat information sharing among other security vendors and partners. Daniel served as Special Assistant to the President Obama's Cybersecurity Coordinator on National Security Council in 2012 to 2017. In that role, he led the development of national cybersecurity strategy and policy and coordinated partnerships across agencies, the private sector, and international counterparts. Prior to the NSC role, Daniel spent 17 years as the Office of Management and Budget, including Chief Intelligence Branch in career senior executive service positions, overseeing intelligence and other classified national security programs, experiences that strongly shaped his latter focus on making cyber policy operational and budget real. Since 2017, Daniel has been the nonprofit sector coordinator at CTA, building mechanisms for scaling collaboration and rapid intelligence sharing across companies to improve collective defense. So if you're wondering if you're in a room full of smart people, that has answered your question. So I'm actually just going to start with since we started this with just kind of this whole process with and Commissioner Gomez was just talking about things that's going on in the government. There's an issue that's going on cyber that has gotten the attention of Congress for a couple different reasons. So I'm going to start with the CISA versus CISA challenge. And we're going to just, first of all, have you guys help define this, because part of the challenge with this CISA versus CISA is that most people don't know that it's going on. People in Congress who sit on the committees understand it. Some people in leadership understand it. People at the Department of Homeland Security who are trying to do their jobs at the government cybersecurity agency definitely understand it. But I'm just going to kind of go down the road here and see if we can get a couple comments on what's going on and how do we best fix this challenge of the lack of understanding between the name of a piece of legislation and the importance of CISA, the agency at the Department of Homeland Security, because we desperately need to fix this problem. So I'll start with you.
First, thank you all for joining us. This is such a great group. We have long had a narrative problem in cybersecurity, and it is a big part of why it causes a lot of confusion and consternation amongst folks that are trying to understand what is going on around them. This CISA versus CISA issue is a microcosm of a much larger problem. That said, we have to be a lot more specific in how we're talking about it to kind of bifurcate the issues. I actually think that the conflation of the two is intentional by some folks, right? To kind of just blend it all together so that it justifies kind of the stalemate that we find ourselves in a number of fronts across both the agency and the legislation. And so kind of having a more nuanced conversation about what each brings and what they benefit, who will feel the impacts of the rollbacks that we're seeing is one of the best ways for us to make some progress.
And Jim, can you help us define the problem here? What is the difference of CISA versus CISA? You've done this for me before, so if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. So one is a piece of legislation that enables information sharing in a protected way. The other is an agency that is radioactive. And part of the reason they're radioactive is because they broadened their remit beyond what the Congress and certainly this administration had in mind to look at truth in advertising, and to remember, not CISA, and CISA gets tagged with this, which is unfortunate, but DHS created, I forget what it was called, like the Office of Official Truth or something, and that wasn't real popular, and it's come back to haunt them. So part of what we've got going on is the old ways we define truth in a public space don't work anymore. This is kind of the Section 230 debate which slops into it, but CISA is held accountable wrongly, I'd say, by this administration for the fact that we had an effort to eliminate hate speech, misinformation, disinformation. I didn't think it was necessary. You can argue with that, but that was sort of where things started to go off the rails, is we will identify disinformation. And as I say, CISA, part of it is the Chris Krebs effect. Chris was the first CISA director. He astutely arranged to have himself fired by Donald Trump, which is the best way to work for the Trump administration. But ever since then, this is a president who holds grudges, and so CISA's in his crosshairs. The fact that people are confused is a little embarrassing, but not a complete surprise.
Michael, is there a solution set to this other than just changing the name of the legislation so it isn't called CISA? Is that our best way forward?
So I've actually been on record as recommending changing the name of the acronym just to avoid the acronym confusion. It seems really stupid, but that's oftentimes how it works in Washington to just change the acronym. I would say that there's a couple of things, right? One is the agency itself, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The prime sin that it committed was saying that the 2020 election was secure. That's the primary sin that it committed. And it was. That election was secure, as was the 2024 election. Both of them actually fairly reflected the votes that were cast. Now, you could talk about whether or not social media influence, people influence operations, all of that. But if you actually talk about the votes that were cast and they were properly counted and reflected the outcomes of the votes that were cast, both of those elections were secure. And so the fact that this administration takes umbrage with that, I think, is a real problem. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 should be the subject of some really interesting poli-sci, masters and dissertations. Because you have a piece of legislation that Democrats think is good, most Republicans think is good, industry supports, the privacy groups don't really oppose, and yet we can't get it through Congress. All we can do is get it extended just barely to the end of this year. So you have to ask yourself, what is wrong in the system that we can't actually get a piece of legislation that has that much broad support across the finish line? And again, there's a misunderstanding about what that piece of legislation actually enables. And mostly, that piece of legislation deals with kicking lawyers out of the room. I mean, that's mostly what it does.
It's a bipartisan goal.
Yes, absolutely. And what I mean by that is it actually provides a structure around information sharing in the cybersecurity space to say that if you are sharing this kind of information in this kind of context, you can rest assured that it is in fact legal to do so. That's what it does. And so if we let it lapse, what you will see, and what we even saw during some of the periods when it did lapse, is the slow creep of reintroducing friction into the information sharing ecosystem. And friction is one of those things that we actually don't need to be reintroduced into the information sharing system.
Rob, your thoughts on that? Because I'm just going to rephrase when I talk about what Michael talks, I say it's the indemnification so important because there's a lot of things the engineers want to share that the lawyers won't let them. And the information sharing, if it's done at the right level and with that indemnification, brings us to a faster conclusion a lot of times of what we've either just seen or what we're trying to stop. So sorry to lead, kind of a leading question there, but
Yeah, I mean, so let me add to Michael's litany of reasons that you shouldn't impose it. I think the scoring on it from a budget perspective is at or near zero. So it costs almost no money, yet it takes away this problem that has been well documented in the space for over a decade. So it makes sense to pass it. Now, how are we going to get over this impasse? That's what I've been trying to focus on. And, renaming CISA the bill is definitely one good option. Another option is to rename CISA the organization and sort of hand that win to the Trump administration to say they got rid of CISA, rename it, recreate it, move it around the org chart within DHS, and then reinvest in it, get the budget back up, rehire people or hire new people and fulfill the mission. Because the biggest problem we have right now, in my view, is that CISA, the organization, has pretty much fallen apart over the last year. It was building capacity, it was building budget, it had grown to a size where it really was having an impact on the ecosystem, and many of the things that the organization was doing have now just fallen apart. So I am by nature an optimist. I think now that we've gone through the lowercase doging of CISA, there could be an opportunity if we say, yep, here's the new version of it, and it's something else. Somebody can make up an acronym. I'm not great at that.
NPPD.
Some people
Please no.
Some people need an explanation. Find us in the hallway afterwards. But yeah, I think
we'll hold a
that may be
contest.
the answer.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So now I want to stay on the budget question because there's two parts to the budget question. One is the government spending, and then the other is commercial spending. And one of my hopes with now that everything is AI, you have to say AI before everything, is we might actually get a privacy bill out of this because there's going to be more of a need for data. And then the other one is that a lot of IT in the organization, they have all these legacy systems that are very kludgy that up until now didn't seem like a big problem if baby parts of it broke. But the advent of AI coming into these systems means we could see some like incredibly amazing forceful helix just smash an entire system that wasn't prepared for it. So do we finally have people's attention on cybersecurity by abstentia through people looking through the lens of artificial intelligence? And are they finally going to get some money? And I guess I'm going to let you choose if you want to go commercial, government, or both. I'll just start here. Yeah.
So I work with companies on this every day. The ones that get it do. They recognize that security is performance. How you make sure your AI systems, and particularly your AI agents, stay in bound, do what you have said they are going to do, don't amass unintended authority, don't, exhibit emergent behavior without you being able to notice it and course correct it. All of those things are recognizing that they have to invest in security in a way that helps them enable the functionality, but also protect them and mitigate risk. Unfortunately, that is a small amount of organizations that realize it at a real tangible, let's put the money behind it level. And there are a number of small and medium organizations and even some large ones that really just want to move fast and don't quite understand how to strike that balance to be able to enable the functionality and the capability in a way that protects them from risk. Unfortunately, I think increasingly we will start to see things that push them in a direction. For example, I had a client call me to say they were effectively DDoSing their customers because their agent was doing something, I won't get too specific, that was flooding their customers with notifications to a point where they were upset, but they could not stop it because stopping the agent meant cutting off critical capability. The more organizations experience things like that one is relatively contained, but it could be much bigger. They will realize that they have to invest in security. And there are a lot of organizations that are contending with this new role that they must play as government pushes down the responsibility of security to state government, and as they look to industry to drive what innovation looks like, they're coming together in these trade associations and consortia trying to think about these issues. So I think there's a contending with it that's happening at industry, but it's not happening fast enough.
Jim, and we can also include the international concerns of what's going on in this space.
Sure. So I look at it from a sort of slightly different perspective. I bumped into a former senior intelligence official at a conference about a month ago, and we realized that we'd both come independently to the same conclusion, which is the Chinese own us, right? So it's like, it's good, it's nice that we're doing all this stuff, but it's not working. And so that was part of why I thought this would be an interesting panel, is whatever we're doing isn't working, right? Part two, cybersecurity has been squeezed out, at least in the public space, by artificial intelligence. In fact, I tell people now, if you're going to write something, make sure you have the letters AI, and it can't be like sale or or whatever. It's a tool, right? And so I'm not now. The AI chat room it might change this a little bit. Yeah, so that's yeah. So it's a little weird, but putting that aside, because we'll see how it plays out. It's a tool, and so the question is who can use the tool better. And I think ultimately the companies will be driven in the direction that Camille was talking about, to use the tool better for defense, but they'll be behind our key opponents, Russia and China. It amazes me the Russians have any economy left to exploit with AI, but apparently they do.
Maybe they're being underfunded. I mean, they're being funded by someone else.
Gee, I wonder who it could be.
I don't know.
So that's kind of, we have to say AI now. I think the advantage lies with our opponents, but we can change that. That's the optimistic, happy ending. We can change that over a period of time, how long that will be. Last time it took about 10 years, right? So maybe it'll be quicker this time.
Michael?
Yeah, I think when you look at like how we've structured cybersecurity across the ecosystem, sort of at a macro level, what we've really done is we've pushed the cybersecurity burden all the way out to the edge, whatever that edge is. And if that edge happens to be JP Morgan Chase, then okay, you're fine, right? But if the edge happens to be my mother, that's not as good, right? And so the way that we've structured cybersecurity overall in the ecosystem doesn't work. That's part of our problem. And so we have to have a fundamental rethinking about how we actually structure cybersecurity. And this is not a technology argument. This is actually about the political and economic organization for how we do cybersecurity as a society. And so we've got to really think about what cybersecurity burden do we want individuals and small businesses to have to shoulder? The answer is some. You don't want it to be none, right? But you probably don't want it to be all. And so the idea that we're going to have a rural water system take on the Chinese, intelligence services all by their lonesome is kind of ridiculous. It doesn't pass the laugh test. So how do you actually re-architect and reorganize our system to enable the security burden to be allocated, more fairly? There's also other issues in the economic structure of how we do software and hardware, right? All of the market incentives are to get your product to market first. There is no prize for being second, right? There used to be a joke in grad school, right? The grad school grading was A or F, right? You either got an A or you got an F, right? There was nothing in between. And so we're in that state with getting things to market. And so that means security takes a back seat. And if you think about most other markets, it's amazing that like software producers bear no liability for how their product actually functions. Like there's almost no other market, no other product out there in the world where that is true. And so we really have to think about, is that the structure that we want for this environment? And how do you do that fairly? How do you change that liability structure, for example, in a way that doesn't kill off innovation? Because you still want innovation, you still want adaptation, you still want progress. But all of these are the questions that I think we have to answer if we want to actually change the dynamics that Jim is talking about, right? And enable people to actually operate in a secure ecosystem.
Rob?
Let me riff on Michael yet again. For at least another 13 hours, the national cyber strategy that Camille and I and others in the Biden administration put out remains in effect. New cyber strategy is apparently going to drop overnight tonight. The critical question for me, the biggest question of all, well, maybe there are two. One is what's it going to say about regulation broadly? But secondarily, what's it going to say about software liability? We made a big push in the last strategy to say, damn it, we need software liability. That cannot be strict liability, but it needs to say, if you do these things and you do them correctly, and there is still a vulnerability in your software that is exploited and causes harm, you should not be liable for it. On the other hand, if you do not do these things, you should be held liable, right? And so it was liability with a safe harbor was the notion. I think this was the absolute most critical thing we did in that strategy, even more so than breaking the taboo against saying we needed regulation broadly in cybersecurity. If that goes away, and if there's no mention of that, we're going to be in a world of hurt, because we know that this administration does not like the idea of, in quotes, regulating AI. We know that Silicon Valley came out very strongly for this administration, for the Trump campaign, over the issue of regulation of AI. And so have they found a happy medium on this where they can say, yes, but don't you think that you should be liable in some way for producing bad software in a world where anybody can now produce software? Literally anybody can make software. There is no longer any kind of barrier to entry. And so given what AI has done, we've got to find a way where we say, okay, Anthropic, what should you be liable for when you enable somebody to produce software? What should you, JP Morgan, be liable for if you use Anthropic to make software, right? And we don't have any kind of model for that in existence today, but that is the most important thing we need to address.
And so I think are you done, Rob? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you can chime in on this one. Last week or the week before, they canceled some executive orders, one of them, which is the one I think Rob is talking about, which people struggled mightily to make it as light a burden as possible. And so all you have to do is attest that you're observing the NIST guidelines, which didn't strike me. The alternative was CMMC, which is take $1 million in 3 years and come back when you're fixed. And so I thought it was pretty cool. And so we will have to come back to this question. I think Michael's point, the starting thing for this is the big three car makers, back when that was a thing, said that if they were forced to observe safety regulations like seatbelts, it would destroy the American car industry. That was 1962, 1963. They were wrong. And so I don't think that requiring people to attest that they've observed the NIST guidelines, especially with the safe harbor provisions, was such a big deal. We'll have to come back to that. Otherwise, why are we keeping NIST around? Which is a question some may be asking.
But you brought up a very good question about whose responsibility is it going to be with software. As we're seeing AI start to build more of that software, and you guys did a great job with SBOM, that you found something that, like, the software bill of materials that actually I'd start to see repeated internationally with no attestation to the United States. And I was like, strangely, that's winning. That's great. The people really just adopted it. Are we working or thinking about working on something that has that new AI layover, which is where are you going to put this in to the layer of responsibility if it's not there, or responsibilities as it current stands? Just kind of open question.
Yeah, I know CISA is working on SBOM for AI. So we'll see what that turns out to be and how it's enforced and how it's used. I think there's a lot of work going on in silos around how do you think about attesting to what's in the software that you created, but it's obviously all voluntary, all to the extent that you're interested in doing so, and has no bearing on all the vibe-coded things that we're talking about right now. There's no uniform application of that. I know that there's a AI security EO percolating too. Maybe that will have some nuggets of either the SBOM for AI or something else that might move forward the software liability question, but we're more likely to see it play out in the courts where some harm has happened and they have to start to parse out who's liable for what. And honestly, that's probably not the way we want it to happen, because bad facts make bad law, which means if it's litigated in the courts, we're likely to see a precedent that is very tailored to that set of facts. And that'll be a really tough place for us to operate from and not actually achieve the desired goal, because everyone will be able to reason themselves out of that framework, most likely, until it hits some kind of critical mass. So I think we're at a precipice where we could see some progress with this EO, with the work that's going on for SBOMs for AI, but I don't know that it will be meaningfully moved forward.
Other thoughts?
Well, I also think that there's a couple of other bigger trends in this space, right? One of which is the continued technological decoupling between the West and China, for example, but then also the drive, for example, for the Europeans to decouple on their own from the U.S. And we can have debates about how likely that is, but you are likely to see continued pressure on from those places. So, for example, all of this may not entirely. If we don't take action here in the United States, we may find ourselves where we're being forced to play the follower, because not everybody will wait for us. And I would say that the geopolitics are making that even less likely. And it's making it more likely that others will move faster and more sharply than the U.S. will.
So what's happening with our reporting requirements, or I guess they're not necessarily obligations, depends on what it is, around critical infrastructure? Because that seems to be a huge challenge too, is now we were kind of coming to a consensus on how we would talk and cooperate with each other around information sharing, and it feels like that's being broken.
I mean, I can start. I mean, the rule, so the critical information, the CERCIA piece of legislation, right?
Always go to an acronym when you can't say the word.
Absolutely. The Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act.
Well done.
Nice.
I do speak Washington acronym.
Yeah.
That act passed a number of years ago, right? Back in 2022. And yet we have been unable to actually get the implementing regulation out of DHS. And actually, this is one place where I feel like the Biden administration's CISA actually fell down in not getting that regulation out before the end of that administration, because now it has been delayed by this administration even further. We're hearing maybe May. But if it goes at the same rate as wow, we're not moving enough.
See, talk about critical infrastructure.
Right,
Lights go out.
exactly. There is movement in the room, just not enough.
Yes.
That's actually really funny.
But again, here we're actually, so we're actually still waiting on that regulation to come out to, exactly define. So there's really two things that actually that piece of legislation said that DHS actually has to define. So the legislation essentially says if you're in critical infrastructure and you have a substantial cyber incident, you've got to report that to DHS, to CISA. So there's two things that actually have to be defined in order for that to go into effect. One, what qualifies as critical infrastructure? And two, what qualifies as a substantial cyber incident, right? Those are the two things you got to define. And actually there have been plenty of comments submitted by both industry, my own organization, submitted comments, a consortium of organizations submitted comments for how you can define that. Both of those things in a way that actually are not overly burdensome to keep the reporting in place. But we're not the only ones with reporting requirements. So the Europeans have the NIS2 directive that's coming into effect that actually requires reporting for critical infrastructure there. The Japanese have reporting requirements, the Indians have reporting requirements, the Australians have reporting requirements. So around the planet, there is a definite move to have reporting from critical infrastructure when it actually experiences a significant cyber incident to start having those incidents be reported to governments.
So what do you think causes more of the challenge on cybersecurity, guidance or money?
So I was thinking while Rob and Michael and Camille were talking, a couple of us were in the Clinton administration, which I guess is embarrassing. But at that time, in the second Clinton administration, NSF...
Yeah, I go back that far too.
Yeah, that's right. So at least two of us. The NSF paid for the internet, right? And there was a point where it got to about 100 million people where they said, we just can't do this anymore. Remember that guy, what was it, Postel, ran it out of his basement?
Yeah.
Yeah. So people said, look, we got to move to some more commercial system. How do we pay for it? And there was a lot of debate. This was Tom Khalil, I think, was head of NEC at that point. How do you pay for the damn thing? How do you regulate it in a way, if at all, that gets it off the ground? We didn't want to kill it, And after a lot of back and forth, the way to pay for it was by trade. You give them your data, they give you services. We don't like that trade anymore. The light touch regulation, that was Ira Magaziner. He'd come out of the triumph of telecom deregulation. And they said, well, we'll have things like Section 230. We'll have other stuff. We don't want to regulate and require. We won't have authentication requirements. So the foundation of this thing, which was so fragile, probably needs to be reexamined, right? It probably doesn't work anymore. But that might be too hard. Sometimes you inherit something and you're stuck with it. So we might be stuck with it. And then the question is, in that context, how do we pay for it? How do we make it work?
And then I think that's where the liability question comes in, because if companies aren't liable for something that they may have caused harm, they're not necessarily interested in spending any money on it. That money goes to sales or marketing to sell more of something that may or may not be breaking things. So is the question, going back to kind of the earlier CISA question, do we feel like we have the liability lever at the right space right now, or is it kind of questionable as we go to AI, or what? Is there thoughts on that?
We didn't have the liability levers right before AI.
Okay.
We certainly don't have it right
now.
now. So, no. I think the incentives in industry to build secure software, to rebuild older software, legacy software, so that it is secure with new AI tools that make it possible are not there, right? The incentive were you the one who said it's yes? Okay, so getting first to market is still the imperative, right? The easiest, cheapest way to do that is not to worry about security. Even though AI can make it much easier and much faster to build secure software, the market is not incentivized to do that. We're not at a point with AI where AI is just writing secure software out the back and you don't need to invest any time or any money into the security of your software. That is a possible vision. I don't know if it's a realistic one, but it is a possible outcome. But it is not the outcome that we have now, right? The models have been trained on all the software that existed from the beginning of the internet until now. Most of that software was not written securely. Therefore, these models out of the box are producing insecure software. And so if you're using those to build software, it's going to be insecure. You need to invest on top of it to build security. We do not have the incentives to do that today.
Jim, I'm going to.
Well,
Go ahead.
and I would just say, if you look on the government side, and if you talk about incentives, one of those quirks of the federal budgeting process, you mentioned that, is that in general, for most agencies, it is far easier to get operational dollars out of Congress than it is to get procurement dollars. So where do you maintain old software? Operational dollars. Where do you get new software and new hardware? Procurement dollars. So the incentive for agencies is to keep old hardware and old software as long as they possibly can. Because it is really, really hard to get the money to get new stuff. But it is very easy to get money to keep the old stuff running, even if over the long run it would be cheaper to get the procurement dollars or to invest the procurement dollars. So you have an incentive structure on the federal agency side that is guaranteed to result in lower security because of the way that we do budgeting for almost every agency across the government.
So I wonder if people could join me in singing Mr. Rogers' theme song, because it was a beautiful day in the neighborhood in 1998. And so having this sort of crummy lash up to produce buggy software and vulnerable networks wasn't a big deal because it ran along it's been a great success. Think of all the things that have come. That's why we're having this conference. What we didn't expect was that the Chinese would wake up one day. There was a big internal debate in China. Should we go with the rest of the world or should we be more nationalistic? Unfortunately for us, the wrong side won that debate. And so we now face a skillful, highly motivated, hostile opponent who has become a peer, frankly. And the internet wasn't designed to deal with a peer opponent, right? And so we're kind of stuck. And that's a lot of what is driving this. If it was still the millennial, the end of history, that it was. See, he left.
Poor Professor Fukuyama.
He'll never live that down.
No.
But it was a nice guess at the time. It's not the end of history anymore. History's back with a vengeance, and the internet wasn't designed to withstand it.
Camille, do you have a comment on that?
Security as a mechanism to drive this kind of incentive shift as we shift from internet infrastructure to AI infrastructure, I think we're at a pivot moment where we could make a meaningful change, despite the procurement conundrum, despite all of these things, if we were so motivated, right? Because we are going to spend procurement dollars to buy the CPU, to buy everything we need to run AI, government, industry, otherwise. I actually think it's a fallacy that industry doesn't want some kind of guidance on where the boundaries should be. Now, they definitely don't want as much as maybe some people feel is necessary or whatever, but I actually think industry would like that kind of guidance and like the US to be on first rather than it shifting to a globally dictated dynamic that is outside of the depth of understanding that happens here. But we're likely to lose that battle. So I think we find ourselves in this moment where it could be ripe for a lot of the shifts, despite some of the boundaries that we face or the hurdles that we face, but we're not going to seize that moment, which is disappointing.
So I'm a really big Silicon Valley, the show. I just love it. I want them to do a reboot so bad, but Robbie said something that reminded me, this keeps showing up on my Instagram feed, the clip where he explains that the son of Anton didn't do the wrong thing. He just tried to correct all the bugs in the software, which was everything, so it deleted everything. And then it ordered pizza. So, if there was, you could redesign cybersecurity policy from kind of square one today. If you walked in and had a client that said, "I'm willing to just go, like, I'm going to take it all off and start," is that even possible? I mean, could you start from like tabula rasa in today's environment?
I'll take the cheap answer and say no.
You have to start from somewhere.
The installed base is just so great, right? And think of how long did we wrestle with BGP? Is it fixed?
It's not fixed.
Yeah. And
We're
that
still
was
on
Tried.
IPv4.
Yeah.
that was around when I came into this stuff like 25 years ago, right? So the pace of change is somewhat disappointing. And we're going to have to deal with an inherited base that's vulnerable. So that points to other kinds of solutions, whether it's agreements with attackers, whether it's better law enforcement. If the Russians and the Chinese backed off the gas pedal, a lot of our problems would be greatly reduced. But to do that, you have to engage with them.
Anyone think we could start it from zero? No?
I don't think that, I think in some ways one possible outcome from some of the AI advances is what's been talked about in the industry is the great cleansing fire of, like a forest fire of vulnerabilities that the AIs will find so many vulnerabilities so fast in all of the old legacy software that it will essentially force companies to like burn down all of the old stuff and essentially replace it with at least, maybe not on the hardware side, but at least on the software side. That is not a zero chance probability, by the way. So, you could see something like that. But I think it's very hard to, we're not at the point where we're deploying this for the first time. So we're not going to be able to really start at zero. But I do think that doesn't mean that we, don't make attempts to improve the incentive structure, to change the liability structure, to change how we talk about guardrails, where we want to put things. Like, all of these things are political choices, and I mean that in the traditional small p sense of the way. They're political choices, they're political economic choices, and we could make different ones.
So we're going to go to questions because we have 10 minutes left, but I'm going to lead with a question with a colleague, a friend in the room, Karen, so be prepared. So Karen's works for a company called Inner Isle, who did a report that came out this, I think it was December, that says that cyber criminal activity is the 4th largest economy in the world. And as somebody, and I think a lot of us in the room are, we all have our own various things. I couldn't get into one of my own credit card accounts. I just had so many accounts yesterday. During the Super Bowl, I'm trying to do all my accounting. Didn't work. But I know that when I try to the best thing I've done for my mom is I've just basically slowly gotten her off of social media by changing all of her passwords, and she doesn't know it, and she thinks that Apple News is internet, so that's fine. So that's like one way to do it, but you have to have somebody who doesn't completely know what the hell's going on for that to work, which might be a bigger pool than I think about. But how do we manage from the consumer side? And Jim will just freak me out and be like, it doesn't matter, the Chinese have all your stuff anyway, why do you bother, is usually your answer.
Scott McNeely, 1998.
Karen, did anything you want to add to that? Okay.
Hear it on.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
It's on.
Thanks for the shout out, Shane. I do have a question for the panel. So one of the things I look at more is cybercrime, particularly frauds and scams. And one of the things that we see when we look at how these mostly commercial criminal actors are operating is they are now much more effective in how they are able to combine resources from the dark web and the commercial economy to build much broader scale and more effective attacks. I noticed that on the panel, you were a lot of times talking about large state actors in terms of China and in terms of Russia. My question is, how are you thinking about the ability for smaller scale actors with AI and other resources to be able to pull together more distributed attacks that are not necessarily centralized from politically motivated state operators?
So I'll take this one to say that, well, if those small operators are in the United States or in Western Europe or any country that still has any semblance of not being a criminal syndicate itself, we can solve that problem, right? That is the problem that the FBI can solve. The problem that we cannot solve is cybercriminal operators in North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia, because we do not have a cooperative party on the other end, right? So if you can't threaten the physical being of the person who is engaging in the crime, whether they're using AI or not, you're not going to be able to stop this, right? And no, we're not going to be able to get cybercrime up to a point where we can deter Russia or deter China or deter Iran or North Korea, right? It's not an important enough issue on the bilateral agenda, if we even have a bilateral agenda with any of those countries anymore. And so, what this means is that ultimately, the burden is going to fall either to the end victim, not an outcome I want. I don't want Michael's mom to have to secure her system against sophisticated operators enabled with AI. It needs to fall on the banks. It needs to fall on the stewards of our data and the stewards of our economy that keep it operating. And so we've just got to place the burden there, and then those companies can find ways to manage the costs of doing business on the internet that we have in the 21st century.
I also think that part of our challenge, right, you're absolutely right. If I look at like the sharing that goes on inside CTA on a daily basis, the overwhelming majority of the information that's shared is about criminal activity. And in terms of what actually affects citizens, not just in the United States, but around the world on a day-to-day basis, most of it is scams and fraud. Right, that's what actually affects people. And yet, there is also this nation-state threat, and they're different, but they're interrelated now because of the issues that Rob was raising. And it gets even more complex because the cybercriminal organizations on the other end have also mutated into highly complex organizations that involve other kinds of crime. So, for example, we're now discovering that a lot of those scams and fraud are coming out of forced, or what I would even call slave labor camps in Southeast Asia, right? Where you have enslaved people that are being forced to commit crimes. And that makes it a lot more complex about how do you impose costs on those people? Because I'm not really sure that that's the right answer either. There are some spaces in here, though, for some increased ability to disrupt those organizations. Because what they've done is they've made themselves into businesses. They've made themselves into highly distributed, highly effective businesses with long supply chains, which actually provides an opportunity for us to disrupt those supply chains if we think about how we're willing to do it. I do think that this means that we have to be willing to reach out and touch computers in other countries in a way that we've not been comfortable doing. And unless we're willing to do that, we won't be able to get at this problem.
Yep.
So just a quick footnote. There's something called the UN Cybercrime Convention, and one of the things I and a few other people will be doing in 2026 is pushing to get this adopted. And the US probably won't adopt it, so I know we're going to lose going in. But cybercrime is a big problem until it comes to actually committing to doing something about it. And then it's like, oh, well, it's number 32 on the list. We'll get to it.
You had a follow-up.
Yeah, I just want to say our recent study that Shane was mentioning is actually called the cybercrime supply chain. And one of the things that we see, and I want to comment on something that Rob said, one of the things that we find in our studies is that a lot of these commercial actors, they are actually using a lot of U.S.-based infrastructure to host and acquire the resources that they need for attacks. Now, they're also using infrastructure and resources in other countries. But that, for me, says, look, we don't necessarily have to just rely on dealing with criminal actors in less than cooperative countries. We have levers in terms of the supply chains that they are using to put together these attacks in which to disrupt those supply chains, because a lot of them are using infrastructure in the United States to commit these crimes.
So, yeah, let me jump in on this. I can't agree more. In the first Trump administration, they put together an executive order that used existing authorities to implement a know your customer program like banks have for cloud providers. It was a very good piece of policy. It also had an off-ramp, which was to say, hey, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, whoever, if you can't do know your customer, if you can't identify who the actual end customer is and then block somebody who is sanctioned or a criminal entity, come to us with alternative measures that show your infrastructure isn't being used by these entities, that you have other ways to prevent it, whether it's putting the actors inside a walled garden until they prove that they're capable, being able to rapidly shut off the activity, being able to cooperate with law enforcement. It was a very good policy intervention in this space that the major cloud providers fought tooth and nail against and managed to slow the implementation of in the Biden administration to the point that it was never put into place in the Biden administration, even though the executive order was not rolled back. This Trump administration has not, to my knowledge, moved forward with their original piece of policy. They also have not rolled it back. So I think we have a solution to this problem in existing policy that needs to be implemented. The problem is I had any number of senior executives at very large corporations whose names I will not mention come into my office and say, this is the number one thing that you need to kill. And those same corporations have a lot of clout in this administration. So I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to get implemented now. But it's absolutely an issue, and we have a solution in existing policy that would partially address it.
All right, time for one last question. I'm going to go to this side of the room since I started on the other side. Question over here? Anyone? Up front? Did you? Yeah, up right here.
Hi, Derek Johnson. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, Derek Johnson with Cyberscoop. One of the things that I am curious about, because we had a discussion about the impact that AI is going to have on our cybersecurity strategy. We've seen in the health arena, we've seen a lot of apps come in. I know that there's sort of health data is sort of protected by very specific kind of laws that other folks aren't. I would love to hear kind of how you all see something like that intersecting with security in the health space, because it does seem over the last month or two we've seen a lot of big companies come out with health apps. And a lot of people use them, so would love to hear your thoughts.
Quick answer on health. Is it better off than the others?
Heavily regulated spaces have tended to really lean in on security for AI systems. They're really concerned about running afoul of the requirements that they already have. And so, I mean, healthcare traditionally has been struggling a little bit, so I'm not sure that means that they'll be out front. But from what I've seen, most of them are leaning in a bit on security. That said, our cybersecurity posture is focused on a lot of the wrong things. We talked a lot about focusing on the perimeter. Now we need to be focused on like delegation of authority and dependency and things like that. That is a modality shift or a mental model shift around governing systems, leveraging security that is a little bit different and may not be at the forefront for them.
Any other comments quickly?
I mean, I would say there's I think this will drive, particularly in the United States, this question of your health data and how it's used. Like, that is very sensitive to a lot of people. What's interesting is that a lot of that is around the issues of your health insurance coverage, right? And whether or not you can be denied benefits and things. And one of the really interesting things is if in other societies where health coverage is not as dependent on the private sector in that way, the concern about health data is actually much lower. Because it can't be used to like kick you off of benefits and things like that. That's not even possible. So the concerns about health data are actually very culturally and like socially determined depending on the larger environment.
Please join me in thanking my panel. I appreciate it tonight.
All right, good morning. My name is Chris Teal. I am the managing editor of Route 50, which is part of the GovExec media group covering state and local government. I'm really happy to be here today for this excellent panel. Usually the last panel before lunch is kind of pressurized, right? Because you want to live up to expectations, and the last thing that you want to do is be the panel that people talk about at lunch and kind of go, God, that was a load of rubbish, wasn't it? Mercifully, we have 4 experts who are here to talk about BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program from the federal government, $42 billion coming down to the states to roll out broadband. And we're going to have a great time. So what I'm going to do, I'm feeling a little bit power hungry this morning. I'm going to work my way down the line. What I'd like my panelists to please do is tell us who you are, the work that you do, and then, because it's that time of year, maybe share with us your favorite Winter Olympic sport. And if you don't do the Winter Olympics, that's totally fine. You can say that, but I'm just curious because it's you know, it's fun, right? So why don't we start with you?
That's good. So Paul Garnett, I run a consulting firm called Vernonberg Group. We focus 100% on closing the global digital divide. So we work with clients both in the U.S. and in emerging markets to help bring high-speed, affordable internet connectivity to unserved and underserved communities. Actually, it's funny. I had a conversation yesterday with my wife, and the question I asked her was, which Winter Olympic sport do you think you'd be best at? Yeah. And that was an interesting conversation. But in terms of, and my answer is not the one that I would be best at, but in terms of the ones that I think are the most exciting is the downhill skiing. Absolutely, that's the most thrilling thing to watch for me.
Hi, Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, director of the Center for Technology Innovation, founder of the AI Equity Lab, which workshops AI with subject matter experts in areas of health, criminal justice, financial services, employment, and the author of a book, which is now a year old, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. You're all lucky. I wasn't ashamed being a person to bring it and show it because I forgot it. But it's available wherever books are sold and Audible, and it'll be paperback this year. So Winter Olympics. So I don't do cold, so it's kind of hard for me to figure out which one. Because the last time I tried to ski, I almost broke my leg, and I was 12, and I just never did it again. But I do like the ice skating, like where they're the ice skating competitions. I will stay up and watch. But the other ones, unlike your wife, I just don't do cold, so it's hard for me to figure out which one.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lindsay Moyer. I am with Comcast, been with the company for 16 years. In my role, I work on network expansion, also with our company's investments in strategic nonprofit partners that we work with, as well as our presence at national convenings. Thank you for bringing up the Winter Olympics so I didn't have to. Comcast NBC. Yeah, right. Everyone, hopefully you are enjoying the excellent Olympics coverage from your favorite broadcaster. Legendary February, so tune in, enjoy, watch tons and tons of hours of content, and enjoy how it is being delivered to you through NBC and with Comcast technology as the underpinnings for that. I think I would do curling. I have no idea how good I would be, but I'd give it a good go.
I don't have a commercial here, so Joey Wender, I'm the executive director of the Shelby Coalition, the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition. We're a nationwide organization that works to ensure that all schools, libraries, health clinics around the country have affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. And my answer also was curling, because it's the only sport I watch and I say, I could definitely do that. Definitely.
I want to say thank you, panelists, first of all, because they had no idea that was coming, that I was just going to chuck them a nice big curveball to start with. Since you're all curious, I really like the slope-style skiing, where you are, doing all kinds of flips and tricks on your skis and going backwards down a hill, looking over your shoulder.
That's crazy.
Madness, absolute madness, and I would be dead probably within the first 100 yards. First trick, yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk about what we're talking about today, which is BEAD. The digital divide still persists. But there's a lot of money at stake right now, coming down from the federal government. It's been fiddled with. We've had policy tweaks, we've had changes, we've had plans, we've had revised plans, benefit of the bargain. It's been an interesting few years since it got put in the infrastructure bill. But I want to start with a very general question. We've had the internet for a long time. I remember getting dial-up, and it was very exciting, even despite my boyish good looks. I do remember a time pre-internet. We still have a digital divide. Why? Paul?
It's a big question.
Right? I was going to say, right?
Yeah.
Start with a softball.
Yeah, I think, first of all, there are all kinds of digital divides, right? So you kind of put them into sort of two main categories. One is an infrastructure gaps. The other is what we call adoption gaps. So, but I think in the case of both of those gaps, so on the infrastructure gap, you've got basically 6 million or so U.S. households that still don't have access to infrastructure at home. They couldn't buy high-speed internet connectivity even if they wanted to, and you've got programs like BEAD and ARPA and other funding mechanisms that are designed to close that gap completely. The other gap, as I said, is the adoption gap. That impacts about 25 to 30 million U.S. households. So the adoption gap is much bigger than the infrastructure gap, and in many ways, and we'll talk more about this, the adoption gap is a much harder challenge to address than the infrastructure gap. We all know how to build networks, but we don't necessarily know how to get people to use digital services and sign up for connectivity. But I think fundamentally it boils down to sort of marketplace failures. And on the infrastructure side, there are places that are typically lower population density, higher on average to serve, and are not places where an ISP can make a profitable return on their investment, and so they haven't gone there. So they haven't built infrastructure, and that's the reason why you need programs like BEAD and ARPA and the high-cost universal service programs. And then on the adoption side, similar set of issues. There's another sort of failure there in the market where customers have had services that are perhaps too expensive for them. They're not relevant to them. A whole range of issues have gotten in the way in terms of them signing up for services, and that in turn has an impact on the operators themselves because they can't sign up as many people as they want to and generate revenues off of that.
And I'm going to ask the rest of my panelists. I wasn't accusing of you of being responsible for the digital divide. But Nicole, why don't we come back to you next?
Yeah, so, this is interesting, and it's such a pleasure to be up here with all the folks and to see many of the audience that I started in this work almost 30 plus years ago. I would say that we have a digital divide because we have shamefully just failed to solve it over the last 3 decades. And part of that reason is because I think we've not reconciled this conversation between supply and demand. And that has mirrored, and I talk a lot about this in my book, of really throwing out the concept of digital divide and really dealing with this concept of digital invisibility, that we've had on both sides of the aisle this political will to want to solve something that's related to technology access. But on one side, it has to do with the supply and infrastructure. On the other side, it's had a lot to do with demand. And we've never quite found the sweet spot where we can actually build, accelerated broadband networks while at the same time making them affordable for people. And every time we get close, like we did almost a few years ago, we roll back in one of those areas and then we start all over again. And so for me, it's like a digital divide that is persistently annoying to talk about simply because it's something that we could actually solve. And we have no choice to solve it because everything right now is online versus inline. And with the advent of AI, we're going to find a wider AI divide if we actually don't solve this digital disconnect that we have. So I want to echo what Paul said. A lot of it has to do with where are we investing? How are we spending time thinking about the investments? My kids, when they get a really big research paper, they probably spend hours thinking about how they're going to write the paper. Sometimes I feel that's the same way with rural. We spend hours, days, decades trying to figure out how we're going to solve a topographical challenge and line of sight, all the things we talked about when I started this space 30 years ago when President Clinton was in office. And we still have failed to come up with, I think, a reasonable technology agnostic solution that works for everybody. And the more that we do that, we essentially disservice the people, I think, on the demand side who are now finding themselves caught of having to be digital without the appropriate assets. And so we'd love to catch up on this more, but I do think that it's a combination of political will, investment choices, time spent in the same narrative of this binary narrative, and most importantly, the inability to look at the real eyes on the prize, which are the people. And until we start putting our eyes on the people and why they need to be connected for the companies and communities, I think we're still going to talk about this divide into perpetuity.
So I agree with my fellow panelists. I think the digital divide is not a single problem with a single solution. I like how Paul pointed out the two divides, the access divide, which is having access to the actual broadband infrastructure, and then the adoption divide, which is taking the service, having the means to adopt it in your home, the devices to be able to use it, the skills to be able to protect yourself online and to know how to navigate and use it for the betterment of yourself, your community. So talking about the access divide, that's why this public infusion of resources into this is really going to be transformational when paired with the private sector investments as well. I do believe that we are going to, at the end of BEAD, get the closest that we have ever been to closing that access gap in our nation's history. As Paul mentioned, though the adoption gap is very persistent. And it has persisted in communities that have had access to broadband for quite some time. And so the solutions to solving the adoption gap are very different. I've heard a lot of folks liken where we are at this moment in time to the electrification of rural America. If you look back to how long that took, once folks agreed that that was important to do, it took time. Infrastructure is hard, and I know that we'll talk about that a little bit later in our discussion. And then adoption is hard, and that's just, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. Certainly industry has a role to play in that. Comcast has been at work in the adoption space for quite a few years. You may have heard about programs that we have like Internet Essentials, which addresses affordability, but the other barriers to adoption, including devices as well as skills. We've also launched a number of lift zones across our footprint, which is provides free internet access to communities. And then we invest in partnerships at the local level, which is where folks go to get resources through our $1 billion commitment in Project Up. So I would agree with my co-panelists. There are the adoption gap as well as the access gap, each of which have unique ways that you can begin to address it collectively.
Yeah, Joe?
I'll play cleanup here. I look at it from a public policy perspective, in part because I worked on the Hill for over a decade, and then I just worked in the last administration. I think our public policy with respect to closing the digital divide has been aggressive but incomplete. Okay, so start with the 96 Act, which I think is very appropriate to discuss today, given that this week is the 30th anniversary of the Telecom Act of 96. And the 96 Telecom Act laid out what it meant by universal service. And it made incredible strides at getting us to where we are today, right? It created the E-rate program to ensure that all schools and libraries are connected to high-speed internet. It created the rural health care program, which ensures that rural residents can enjoy the same type of medicine that their urban counterparts get. There's the high cost program, which is a lot of this discussion today, which obviously is about making sure that people in rural areas have communication services. And then there's the Lifeline program. Mm-hmm. And Lifeline is about making affordable personal mobile phone use. Okay, so that's a lot of great steps. I'm going to have a hot take here and say that Congress is actually on the right track. In the last few years, they have identified the holes that exist in the digital divide. I mean, let's name 4 of them. One is BEAD, which is the name of this program, which is the name of the subject of this panel, which is about bringing that access to all Americans, but it's also about the non-deployment money, which we'll get to in a second, right? That connects with the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP. Again, Congress is recognizing that there is an affordability program. Now, we could discuss whether having a one-time infusion or having some year-over-year fund is the right approach, but again, Congress recognized that there is this gap. Third, they passed the Digital Equity Act. Again, recognizing that there are gaps in digital literacy and digital skills out there. And finally, something that it has not enacted but is looking at right now is there is a working group on the Universal Service Fund to say what does this fund or what should this fund look like for years or decades to come. So, I mean, ultimately, our public policy is incomplete, but we do have a lot of the ingredients here that would close the digital divide. I think a lot of it is a question of how does this administration enact or carry out or implement these acts.
Good stuff. All right, so let's talk about BEAD and kind of bring it round to the focus of the panel. And Joe, I want to start with you as well. We'll kind of come back this way, so you can lead off. What is the biggest, in your opinion, the biggest obstacle or obstacles that might prevent BEAD from being successful? Kind of when we reflect on it in 15, 20 years.
Sure. I'm going to go to the adoption side, right? And that's where Paul started us. There's a $20 billion question out there. $20 billion. What is going to happen to the non-deployment dollars, right? What is going to happen to the dollars once we ensure that all dots on the map have access, right? And that question is very much alive right now. We don't know. Right, BEAD has not issued guidance on it. My opinion, our opinion at Shelby, is that states should be allowed to access that money consistent with what Congress said. And Congress laid out a whole plethora of options that could be used, that states could identify in order to close the digital divide, particularly on the adoption, the affordability, the digital literacy side. So I think it's a major open question right now whether that money will be spent in accordance with congressional intent.
Yeah, Lindsay.
So looking around the room, I'm going to assume that there are some policy wonks that have been following BEAD since 2021. And for those of us, I would put myself in that category, who have read initial proposal after initial proposal, final proposal after final proposal, 5-year action plans, answered surveys. It may feel like we've got a lot of work under our belt, and that would be true. But what I like to remind folks is we are right about where BEAD gets hard. And that is where we move from policy setting to actual execution. And what is in execution? The construction of these networks that have been discussed and debated and talked about for years and years. And so I think Administrator Roth said it pretty well when she was speaking at an event and said that defaults are the Achilles heel of a lot of these types of programs. And so when you look at programs like RDOF and ARPA and CPF, I think, this is a big year. 2026 has a lot of deadlines piling up. And so what does that mean for BEAD? How do you appropriately scope and scale what that could look like? I appreciate you mentioning non-deployment funds. If you tease that out and you look at what happened in terms of defaults in some of these other programs, you could look at the rate of default and then, do a little bit of back of the envelope math and identify that perhaps maybe some of these leftover funds, as a result of the benefit of the bargain round, could be held in a reserve, so that with defaults or addresses that were not considered in the BEAD map, that they would get the opportunity to get service through through the BEAD program. And so, you know, I think we'll talk about specific things like poles and permitting, as well as private rights of way, things like easements, that at this point in time, when we're just on the cusp of execution, we don't know the full extent to which that will play out in BEAD. But looking at the scale of BEAD and the fact that it is designed to be the program that closes the access divide once and for all, I think there are some key learnings about those items that can help us get a sense of how big a problem they could present in BEAD.
Cool. So I would just say on BEAD, so I was excited and continue to be excited about the level of investment, considering that I followed a lot of government investment dating back to the Technology Opportunity Program and then the Broadband Opportunity Program. So I go way back years ago when we first started seeing an infusion of government capital. What I think has to be answered, though, as we see states and localities begin to build out their networks, are these questions of, if we build it, will they come? And I do not think that we've sufficiently addressed the non-deployment funds in a way that actually drives consumer adoption, especially at a time where we have given people the Affordable Connectivity Program and then we took it away. The confidence and trust in the networks that are being built will stand the test of time as to whether or not people are going to see them as an efficient supplement to their ability to be connected to something that's going to improve quality of life. So I think that's something that we need to think about. Where do the non-deployment funds go, and how do we use it to, again, balance this tension that exists between supply and demand? I also think it's important that we think about the resilience of these networks. I see a few of you in this room. We have seen networks to be developed, and we know that there are questions about resiliency, maintenance of those networks, the extent to which those networks are modernized. You know, this is a question I think that we need to continue to answer. When we invest these assets, how will these be regularly maintained? The Assistant Secretary has made it known that this might be the last government subsidy that goes to states. She's been pretty clear that the government doesn't want to invest more money in this. This kind of goes to what Joey talked about. Congress has done a good job of putting the right public policies out there, but I'll add a caveat, but they haven't finished the job. And so part of it is like, how do you make sure that you have networks that can be maintained? What support will be needed so that it's still a balanced funding mechanism of private industry and government, and not just one, because we've seen how that's worked out in the past. And then two, you know, how do you ensure that the conversations around the growth of these networks accommodates these other demands that have also thrown themselves in, like satellite and other things that all of a sudden are being redirected to resources that were sort of developed around fiber. So I'm more curious about that. I'm just sort of sitting down with my popcorn trying to figure out what's going to happen next. But if history is any level of detail, there's a potential that we'll see that these networks may be subjected to corrosion over the years because of the lack of government investment alongside industry.
Yeah, I guess the analogy I think of is like hills and mountains, and I think on the infrastructure side, there's a lot of challenges that we're gonna run into. There'll be issues around defaults. That's inevitable. There'll be companies who made promises that don't fulfill them, and someone else is going to have to step in and take on the responsibility. There'll probably be another round of BEAD infrastructure funding, I would guess, because there's going to be locations that were missed the first time around. There's new construction that happens in rural America all the time, and they'll have to take care of those locations as well. There are things like permitting, definitely challenges around that, but there are, eventually they can be addressed. To me, the mountain is the adoption issue. That's our Everest, right? I mean, it's like, how do we solve that problem? I do a lot of work with internet service providers, both in the U.S. and in emerging markets. We guide investments in those companies. I actually invest in some myself. The internet service providers know how to build networks. They know how to bring high quality service, 5 nines kind of network builds, and they can do all that. The thing that is always the challenge for them is getting customers and getting and generating enough revenue off the network from those customers in order for them to be sustainable. That's really hard, and I just worry that we're going to end up with all these networks built and services rolled out, and you're still going to have this segment of the of the population that does not sign up for service, even if it's available. And again, there's a host of issues around that. Affordability is one of them, but even as we saw with the ACP, even when you make it free, some people don't sign up. So there's trust issues and all kinds of other things that are relevant there.
Yeah, absolutely. Several of you have brought it up, and I think we should keep pulling on this thread of the non-deployment funds. It could be as much as 21 billion, I think, is one estimate we've heard out of an original 42 that, it turns out we just kind of have this big pot of money. I guess I want to make this a little bit more free form, so whoever wants to start can feel free. But I mean, what do we do with it? How do we make it happen? How do we make it a reality? And how does it end up not being, dogged by accusations of it being, a slush fund or, anything else that it could get mixed up in? Who wants to take the first swing at that? No pressure.
I would start just by saying that this was anticipated. That we always knew there was going to be money left over. We worked on Vermont's BEAD plan. And I remember having back and forth with the staff, and they're like, "Oh, we're just going to spend it all on fiber builds, and we'll be done." And it's like, no, if you've been successful in bringing connectivity to all the locations in the state, you're going to have money left over. It could be $10, or it could be $10 million. It's going to be something, So what is your plan for that money? And then if you look at the Infrastructure Act itself, there's a whole list of things that are in the act that Congress anticipated could be candidates for programming and funding that were not just about last mile network deployments. I also I don't really like this whole non-deployment deployment language, because even on the list of so-called non-deployment activities, you have things like bringing connectivity to community anchor institutions and Wi-Fi for multi-dwelling units and other activities that actually are very related to deployment, just not necessarily deployment of last mile infrastructure. So I think all of this was anticipated, and the good problem that we have is there's so much leftover funding, and part of the reason for that is because NTIA took a technology neutral approach to the last mile connectivity piece. For a while there, it looked like it was just going to be fiber, and of course, if it were just fiber, that would have cost $120 billion, which is 3 times the size of the BEAD appropriation. So thank God for other technologies coming into play and picking up the hardest to reach places and making commitments to connect those. So yeah, I mean we're gonna get some guidance from NTIA hopefully on this, and there is a whole bunch of money there, and Congress anticipated that some amount would be left over and for those kinds of purposes and potentially others that NTI identifies.
See, Joey, I know you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a framing problem here on two fronts. I think the first, and Paul started on this road, though I'm gonna correct his language. Like, we've got to stop saying leftover money. It is not leftover money. It's additional money, or it's money that was appropriated by Congress to states to close the digital divide. That's what it is. Okay, so that's the first point. I think the second point is, and it's a lesson I learned, ARPA and capital projects have been referenced a couple times. I mean, that's what I did under the last administration. I was the director of the Capital Projects Fund at the Department of Treasury. And something I said over and over again was, Washington does not know best. These programs are designed to defer to states, right? This is not RDOF, right? These are not supposed to be federally centered programs. Both the Treasury money and the BEAD money, the idea is to defer to states explicitly. It lays out the steps in which states come up with their plan. How are you going to use the deployment money? What we call non-deployment money. How are you going to use it? And so long as it's within the rules, right, that NTIA sets out, states should be allowed to go forth. States know best what their connectivity needs are, and it's different between New York and Nebraska and North Dakota, and that's part of the point. That's the whole intent behind these programs. And so what I'd really want to see is an emphasis on state decision-making, local decision-making, state discretion. I mean, Paul referenced community anchor institutions, right? States themselves, we think, are best positioned to decide what is and is not an anchor, right? Obviously, schools, libraries, health clinics are, but there's a whole long list in the Act. And then there's a catch-all phrase in the Act about community support organizations. I think those decisions should be made in state capitals on the local level and not here in D.C.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Joey says. I think that there should be some discretion to the states to determine how they want to actually distribute that money that is going to be left over. One, it can fill the gap of what was lost from the Digital Equity Act itself when it was appended. But most importantly, I think there's another caveat that could be added. Digital literacy is one side of this. I think that there's also this opportunity for states, by revisiting the community anchor institution discussion, to do more institutional capacity building. We're assuming, because technologies move so fast that people just want basic literacy, but they're going into institutions that are also do not have basic literacy or technology assets. So what does a new library look like? What does a new school look like? How does a state start to think about the role of correctional institutions as anchor institutions within their community when they're trying to bring access to rural communities, right? Could there be an opportunity to do some type of model which brings access to people who are visiting loved ones at the bus station? I think states should really begin to think about how are we building not just the individual, but the community, but the institution? Because at the end of the day, that's going to be the byproduct of whether or not we've had a successful job, that a senior can walk into a doctor's office and be able to get the same type of service that someone else is getting who lives in a quite wired community. I do like this idea also of a consideration of reserve based on what I said earlier in terms of resilient networks. Where are we going to find money to fill the gaps if things fall off? And then I also think, to Paul's point, this could be an opportunity to rebid out to smaller communities who just missed the mark. Are there localities where we need to actually rethink where we didn't put enough money in, or we might have missed them because they weren't prepared to actually compete in this space, where they also might be experimenting. I remember when we did the BTOP experiments and pilots. I don't know if some of you remember, but that was, 10 years ago or so, that we started thinking about ways to sort of reimagine Lifeline through these BTOP projects. So the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program was having this, it was either BTOP or was, at that FCC, they wanted to do these pilot projects. What we ran into, if some of y'all remember, is we didn't have any money. So a lot of people reimagined pilots to actually rethink how to bring broadband into communities along the same verticals that we're talking about. They did it 10 years ago, but there was no money to do so. So I do think giving states the ability to sort of think about where are we missing, what do we need to do better experimentation, right, would be very helpful to move the needle. I just worry that this money, and I guess I'll say it, will be caught up in other things that have nothing to do with closing the digital divide. I worry that it'll go into AI infrastructure and data centers because it's a slush fund of opportunity. I worry that it may go into money that's addressing children's safety in terms of campaigns versus thinking about what we're trying to solve here. I think we need to really think about how this money goes to the bread and butter of what we're trying to solve, so then we can do the appropriate campaigns and training and have the distribution for information, good information to get out to families and communities.
I'll just touch on a couple things because my fellow panelists had hit on them. One, you heard reserve fund mentioned, I think, quite a few times. These dollars, and I appreciate the BEAD dollars to solve the gaps, close the gaps that BEAD was intended to close, should be used for those purposes. They should be used to ensure that we get connectivity, that Americans that do not currently have access to broadband, at the end of when these dollars are spent, have access to broadband. And so reserve fund was talked about quite a few times, whether that, is solving for default, solving for new addresses that are added to the map, or addresses that were missed in the map. That could go a very long way to making sure that BEAD accomplishes its goal and that we accomplish the mission through appropriate use of these funds. The other thing, and I think we'll talk a little bit about barriers to deployment in a minute, is taking these funds and making sure that they are being helpful to overcoming barriers to deployment, which anybody that's ever worked on broadband in rural America from a public policy perspective or from a construction perspective are aware of. You've got poles. What does the pole infrastructure look like in rural America? You've got permits. In rural America, what does permitting capacity look like? Who is on deck, who is prepared, who has what they need to make sure that when they are getting all of these permits to get broadband out, that they're able to process them and not delay the project in an expedited manner. And then you've got the private rights of way, things like easements. I don't know if anyone in the room has heard about easements or had the privilege of working on easements. This can really delay or jeopardize an entire project from getting done. It's complicated, it takes time, it takes resources, and so I do think that these BEAD funds, ensuring that the mission of BEAD gets accomplished, that Americans in the rural and hardest to reach areas of our country get the promise of broadband delivered it should be, priority number one.
Absolutely. Lindsay, I want to stay with you. Since you brought up the idea of permitting and infrastructure and all this sort of thing, I'd love to just hear more, maybe perhaps starting with you, and we'll come to some other folks, about how do we make that side of the house a little bit maybe easier to get some of these projects done? Is it just a case of changing the law and putting in some shot clocks and speeding up the permitting process and off it goes? I assume it's a lot more nuanced than that, but I would love to just start a discussion about that.
It is a lot more nuanced than that, but I do think that action at the federal, state, and local level, it's kind of an all-of-the-above approach that it's going to take. And each issue is unique and has its own nuance. You've got certain amounts of authority over here, certain amounts of authority over there. I think the number one thing is just being in conversation with one another, whether it be providers communicating with the state broadband offices communicating with the utility owners, the co-ops, the local communities, making sure that everyone is in a solution-oriented mindset and coming to the conversation with the end goal in mind, that we want to get this done. I think we had a pretty good and interesting result last week. The FCC's rapid response docket came to a decision on a issue between Comcast and a utility provider in the state. And I mean, there's make-ready costs, things like that when you actually engage in the construction of a network, make-ready costs that were not foreseen when you were let's go back to the benefit of the bargain round. You have a couple of weeks to pull together your application, to submit it, and then you go through curing, and then it gets approved. When you get out and you actually start constructing and you get the receipts of these make-ready costs, if you're being charged for a third-party provider's issues with the polls, I mean, that can blow the financials of an entire project, or it can delay it to the point where you have to go through a long bureaucratic process at the state PUC and then the federal level. So I do think that it'll take an all-of-the-above approach. We have to be in conversation with one another. We have to know where the barriers are, and then we have to really agree to just what does everybody bring to the table? What are all the stakes? And let's find a path towards resolution. These communities have been waiting for long enough. It's time to get to work.
Who else wants to take on permitting? A nice small topic for us all to...
I guess the only thing I would just add that sort of on the good news side, there's been a lot of good action at the federal level. And the case last week, the case in Virginia is an example of that, where common sense prevailed on that one. But at the federal level, a lot has happened to accelerate environmental reviews, historical preservation, and on federal land reviews. So there's a lot that state and local governments can learn from what has happened at the federal level and use some of those models to accelerate what's happening locally. And NTIA certainly can play a role on that, as can other federal agencies in helping their state and local stakeholders better understand how that all works.
Right. I'll just add one little thing that I probably thought I would never say as part of the permitting conversation, but it's some recent work I've been doing at Brookings on data centers who are having the same conversations about permitting, expedited environmental reviews, et cetera. I think this is an interesting time because I do agree with you. We're making a lot of progress on the federal side of expediting and accelerating the process, something that we've been working on for many, 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 many years. And now I think we're at a point where it's in coinciding with the government build out. But I would add this, as I've been on the other side among state and local leaders who are now looking at the permitting process on the AI side. It appears to me that at some point there might be an interesting convergence of these conversations that are going to happen for the better, for the worse, right? Based on the crowdedness of the polls and the extent to which the utility companies are still sort of between the two spaces. Could be a great opportunity, and I'll just add this out because this is what I do at Brookings, to sort of think through how these spaces converge before they hit a roadblock versus to sit back and watch them both in parallel operate. I mean, data centers and AI need telecom assets, point blank, full stop. And I think that's a conversation that we're not having enough of, the extent to which even if we build out AI, we still need basic access to internet-enabled devices for people to take advantage of it. And in my history of watching this debate, it is something I think for those of us who follow this in this space to keep an eye on, right, as to where these areas will find themselves, converging, where they might become more disparate, and how that's going to impact, I think, the full ecosystem that we're trying to build when it comes to the technology economy and what that looks like for these rules that we're creating today. So I thought I would just add that as some things that you should know, which I have found to just be extremely interesting on the data. We've published, just for a shout out, 2 papers, Darrell West and myself on data centers. We just published a paper last week on community benefit agreements, but it's just an interesting conversation that's not being had as to the role of telecom facilities in this conversation.
You've all talked about digital skills and digital literacy and all this sort of thing. And I kind of approached this subject thinking about last night and some of the commercials which had me waking up in a cold sweat.
Why they were that bad?
A couple that were a little bit much, if I'm being honest. But I mean, that's just me. And I consider myself fairly digitally literate and maybe know a thing or two about technology. But Nicole, I want to start with you since you wrote the book on it. How do we approach digital literacy, digital skills in this kind of era of BEAD? What are we doing right? What are we getting wrong? What can we do better?
So I'll just share a couple of examples from my book. When I went to a rural community and met a person who was a 4th generation resident in Staunton, Virginia, he needed digital access because he was a day laborer and he was not able to find a job. And he knew how to use his technological device, but due to a variety of reasons, he could not maintain his service. And the reason he stands out is I interviewed him and his family. I left and came back 2 weeks later, and he was still unemployed. And for me, that is a digital skill that we're not reaching if someone doesn't know how to navigate through this digital ecosystem in a way that makes sense for their quality of life. Having been a person, and you talked about Internet Essentials, I just found a report from 2010 on Internet Essentials when that program was started in my archives. I pulled it out of the crate. I was going to give it to Brett Perkins as a souvenir. And when I think about digital skills, when I started in this space, digital skills was essentially connecting people to certifications, word processing, certifications like network security. In my work, I was taking people who lived in public housing and teaching them network certification, and they were moving out of public housing because they had an identifiable credential that allowed them to actually compete. I think things have changed, right? We're teaching people digital literacy skills, but it's no longer about email. We're teaching folks about how to connect to the internet for jobs, but it's no longer about jobs. It's about your ability to maintain some privacy when you go into that library and you put your resume online in a public kiosk and what happens to that data. It's about your ability to follow through on that application because they don't call you anymore. The next stop is an email saying that you've passed this part of the certification. I want to set up an interview. So I really go back to what Joey talked about in terms terms of universal service. For me, outside of it being personal, it's one of those things like we have to go back to digital skills the same way we looked at why we wanted universal broadband in the first place. We wanted people to have immediate, real-time access to information. And we want people to have real-time access to those skills that are going to improve the quality of their life. For me, in my research most recently, after doing this for 30 years, it's about how is digital access and literacy going to improve the quality of your life? How are you going to become much more economically prosperous? How are you going to have better life chances? How are you going to thrive versus surviving in a space where you no longer can hand over a business card? You actually have to have something on your phone that someone scans as a QR code, which I don't know how to do myself, and I can't imagine anybody else who doesn't have the level of competency that I have. And so I feel like we're still sort of talking about sometimes the same skills, or to Joey's point with Shelby, with many of his partners, we're not allowing those organizations to break free of the traditional paradigms for how we've looked at digital literacy. And so I think we need like a total disruption, as technology would say, of the space, so that we're matching people into areas in which they're actually improving upon their ability to be much more competitive today.
It's hard to top that, particularly given that she wrote a book about it. But
yeah, it is hard, isn't it?
Very hard, very hard, very hard. But I would acknowledge this. When it comes to digital literacy and digital skills, I do think there's a real bias against it, particularly in communities like this. I'm just going to say the words. You all have at least 1 or 2 devices on you right now. You walked in, there's probably 1.7 devices per person at this conference right now. Right, this stuff we take so for granted. So for granted. And I can tell you, I visit a lot of libraries and schools as part of my job, and I go to libraries and people want to talk to the digital navigator. Like they want these skills, right? And sometimes it's even the most basic skills. I was at a library earlier this year, or late last year, I should say, and it was a group of, it was over 50 women in a back room learning Excel. Whether that be for personal finance, whether it be for starting a business, whether it be because they're just geeks and they're curious and interested in how Excel works, because it's an incredible product, right? That we just take it for granted. We just do. Everybody in this room just takes it for granted, and it's just not the case. There's so many people in this country that do not have those types of skills. And sorry for shaming you from being on your phones.
I have a couple things written down that struck me that my fellow panelists said. One is, Paul, adoption is our Everest. And then I think you shared long-term sustainability. These investments in these networks can result in tremendous economic development opportunity if they are used meaningfully by the communities and by the people that live in these communities. And so we talk about resiliency of these networks, long-term sustainabilities of these networks. Think about the multiplier effect. You take the investments of BEAD, coupled with the investments of the private sector companies that are building these networks out, and then you talk about the digital navigation, the digital literacy, all of that. There was a report a few years ago by the National Skills Coalition, just to crystallize it a little bit more, that 92% of jobs back 2 years ago, I'm sure the percentage has gone up, require at least one digital skill. This is not like for the state of the net related jobs that we're talking about. We're talking about day laborers. We're talking about folks that work in meatpacking companies. We're talking about just everyday life. And so you invest to deploy these networks, to go to these communities. To make them sustainable, you need folks to take the service. And for them to take the service, they have to understand what they can use it for. And so it strikes me as we can't miss this opportunity. It makes good business sense to have strong adoption. It's a good ROI on our collective investment as a country to have adoption of these networks. and what adoption can do from a financial and economic development perspective, who knows? But it could be, and we should expect it to be tremendous.
I guess just a couple things I would add to what has already been said on digital skills. I think sometimes it's a question of what are we even talking about when we talk about digital skills.
Right.
So, digital skills, that's on a continuum, right? So it's anything from, teaching grandpa how to actually get online for the first time all the way to educating the next generation of computer scientists. And, the workforce that will work at data centers and that kind of stuff. And so there's this sort of continuum, and I think it's important and all of it matters, right? So anything from basic digital skills all the way to and how to use technology to creating technology, all of that matters. So I would just say that it's important for state broadband offices, territorial broadband offices, when we talk about BEAD, have the flexibility to do workforce, that's great, but also don't forget about granddad and rural America is 10 years older than urban America, so we have to take care of them as well. So it's the continuum. And the other thing just to add is we did a paper recently for International Telecommunication Union, and there is no globally harmonized way of measuring digital skills attainment. So it's like, how do we even know whether people even have digital skills? So I think that's another thing that we definitely could benefit from is some sort of agreement on okay, what does it mean to have basic digital skills all the way up to advanced digital skills, and then have a mechanism for measuring attainment of it so that we can know whether people actually have acquired the skills they need to participate in the economy.
Well, can I jump in on that? Because one word I didn't say, and I normally say it one time in a panel, is equity, right? I do think it's important that however we distribute this, that we're doing it in a way that also, to everybody's point, also targets who are we talking to when we talk about digital skills, right? So I think it's really interesting in some of the work that I've been doing. You could talk to big populations of people. I've had the opportunity to talk to 500 people in a room. They actually know what you're talking about, and they just need some language to sort of frame what it is, right? So people who work locally know you could be in a room, you can start talking about all these things, this. They actually know what you're talking about, but the challenge is not necessarily knowing what you're talking about, is having the equitable access to that technology to be successful. And so I think part of the digital skills and literacy conversations have to really have a pinpoint of who are we trying to cover. If the BEAD program was committed to unserved and underserved communities, we should be doing the same thing when it comes to digital skills and digital literacy. What communities are not getting the resources that they need in their local libraries? How is a rural, when I did my book, it just hurt me that rural Americans, for example, in one instance, had to wait 2 hours for a doctor to come to their community because of the distance they were from a hospital, and then wait 2 weeks before that doctor returned and had no communication whatsoever to actually hear because they didn't have access to broadband. And so I think if we start, I think we could actually measure some of this stuff by looking at our impacts on health, our impacts on education, our impacts in these areas. Are we seeing better throughputs and outputs because we've created much more, less difficult situations where people can be connected, and we're sensitive to, these are just folks that just have to have general literacy around why they have to use their phone to monitor their blood pressure when they're not with their doctor, or they need to be online to be able to talk to their teacher during a snow day, right? PG County right now is adding all these days because we lost learning days, and I'm thinking if we just had people in virtual learning, right, we probably would have gained 5 of those days, right? But it's things like that I think we have to consider, where are those equity drops so that we can do a better job targeting that.
Look, we're at time, and I don't want to keep anybody from lunch and what have you. I'm told it's a networking lunch, whatever that means. But I'm sure our panelists will be more than happy to speak more if you have questions or comments or thoughts or anything else. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking them. Thank you guys so much. Have a good rest of the show. Thank you.
funny how you're saying how the profit layoffs, it's like penetrated into my world. So obsessed with our own sort of little vertical. It's like-
all of our worlds, right? I think just with media, everybody cares about it.
Yeah,
And so
because we report on.
and so like my timeline, my LinkedIn timeline.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Like when there was that big trust and safety.
Yeah. Yeah. So the nonprofit world's a little bit opaque. The people who are not from understanding of the dynamic. Yeah. And like the funding models and oh, so you know where the bodies are buried? Is it- Excellent. And is it Shabazz or Boss? Gonna do it phonetic here. All right. Be free to get going. Oh, no, you don't have to get up. Is it okay to go? Excellent. So I think we're going to get going. Thank you so much for being here. We all ready to rock and roll? Excellent. Thank you. So my name is Nancy Scola. I'm a journalist based here in Washington, D.C. I write about technology, politics, policy for a variety of publications. So we are here today to dive into a great topic. The panel is called Sovereign AI and the New Internet Order, Governing Intelligence Across Borders. So sovereign AI, in theory at least, is the idea that countries might have more control over the development and deployment of AI within their borders. In practice, though, as became clear on our planning call, what it actually means on the ground is something we're all still trying to work out. So one of the things I wanted to do today was just flesh out what do we actually mean by sovereign AI, put some meat on the bone there, and then we'll aim to answer the question, what does sovereign AI, this push towards sovereign AI, mean for the future of the internet and the development of technology more generally? So we have a great set of panelists to discuss that today. We have Kelly Wicker. Kelly's down in the end. She's the Vice President of Technology, Innovation, and Space at Meridian International Center. We have Adrian Shabazz. He's Vice President of Research and Analysis at the nonprofit organization Freedom House. Caitlin Clark is a Senior Director for Cybersecurity at the law firm Venable, and was previously Senior Director of National Security on the National Security Council. And we have Morgan Reed, who's the president of ACT, that is a trade association for small and mid-sized tech companies. So as for logistics, I'm going to get it going, ask a couple questions of our panelists. We talked in our prep call about keeping this pretty conversational. We want it to keep it lively. I'm going to ask a couple questions, talk amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for audience discussion. So really, please be thinking about what you might want to talk about with the panelists and with the rest of the folks gathered today. So with that, Kelly, I'm going to start with you. Part of what you do at Meridian is to get people smarter on technology so they can make better decisions, policy decisions, both domestically and also through diplomatic channels. So you get us smarter, just to lay some groundwork, get us smarter on what is sovereign AI as you see it.
Oh man, you can ask me the hard one.
No pressure.
And it's funny, we talked about this on our prep call. One of the biggest problems with having conversations about sovereign AI is that everybody means a different thing when they say sovereign AI. And so I think what really seemed like we were coalescing around was two different concepts. Sovereign AI first in the understanding of a country's ability to control the data, the compute, the talent, every aspect of the tech stack, and having, especially this comes into play with data centers. Do you have a data center that is yours in your borders, that is subject to your laws? And this is, I think, what we see a lot of discussions with the Global South coming up with this is wanting the control of every aspect of the AI model and stack. The other side of it, when we talk about sovereign AI, is often we're talking about the governance of it internationally. So the standards, the measurements, the definitions, who is determining those, and how much independence do you have in your laws to set that based on your principles and values within your country versus how much of that is getting imposed on you from outside, whether that's from an actor like the US or China that's the ITU, the UN, what have you. And I think it's important to talk about both of those definitions of sovereign AI, I'd say. There's other things you can talk about with that, but let's stick with just those maybe.
Okay. Excellent. And when you say, as a layperson I hear sovereign AI, am I supposed to take from that this sort of separation from the United States or separation from China? What is the sort of like noun?
Both.
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 Yeah. Okay.
And so I think that's also where back to data centers. So you're going to build a data center using somebody else's tech. It is unlikely that if you are Rwanda, you're going to build with Rwandan chips and Rwandan people, and that's just not going to happen. But they want to be able to have a data center in Rwanda that they have full control over, and that there was a lot of fear that the US or China could somehow backdoor itself into your systems, and then they would be able to restrict your access to those models. Mm-hmm. So usually a sovereign means that no one can do that to you. You can maintain control of how your systems are available and how they're used.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Adrian, you and Freedom House focus a lot on human rights. It's sort of the gist of the organization, right? There's some people actually like this idea of AI customized for a local population's needs, right? You hear talk about sovereign LLMs, large language models, that might be customized to meet the needs of a particular population. Is that, other people see it, I think more commonly might be the sense that it's a tool for authoritarians to exert even more control over the population. Where does Freedom House come down on that, or where do you come down on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this. I think this is the most Star Wars-y title for a panel, so I think we win that award. So I think this gets back to what is sovereign AI and what are the reasons that we're seeing this push. And I might break it down into 4 different reasons. I think on the one hand, there is a lot of governments and business people around the world who are looking at the economic opportunity that AI brings, and they want to make sure that they are in on the train in the way that maybe they might have missed it with Web 2.0 or an earlier set of technologies. And that, I think, is generally a good faith approach to this. The second is this question of de-risking, and I think it was initially from China, but more and more from the United States, and particularly as this narrative has evolved in Europe. The third, and that's where the European narrative is really interesting here, is it's about some people are justifying this as we need to be able to enforce our own laws. And so this is no more than, let's say, democratic oversight over technology in a way where whatever laws apply offline must be applied online. And then there's also this bad faith approach, which is actually about control. And this is part of, it's really interesting, even the term sovereignty. I mean, this stems from 2010, remarks from Chinese Communist Party officials who are talking about why China should have the right to control its own information space and sort of disconnect from the global internet. And so very early on, they were the ones at international bodies trying to move internet governance away from a multi-stakeholder model and towards one where governments have a lot of controls. And now the Russian government has adopted that, the Iranian government has adopted that, and now it's really interesting to see this move towards democracies picking up this narrative. And that's where I think it's gonna really depend on which country is it that is adopting sovereign AI and for what purposes. And so if it is actually about localization, if it's about, I mean, there was a great example of a nonprofit in India, for example, that's using local LLMs in order to make government services more accessible to people in a country where there's so much linguistic diversity. So that's a great application of it. There's also applications, though, and this is written into laws in China, in Russia and Belarus and other places where the AI companies must agree to, let's say, aligning themselves with core socialist values, or in the case of Belarus and Russia, it's traditional values, whatever that might be. And we know what that is, that a lot of times it's censorship towards and control of minorities, of ethnic and religious minorities, as well as dissent. And that's something that we've been tracking a long time at Freedom House, is this idea of authoritarian governments essentially want to disconnect from the global internet in order to be able to control and run their own repressive enclaves.
Okay, excellent. And we'll get into domestic politics, I imagine, in a little bit, but this push towards an AI space that's in line with Belarusian values or whatever,
Belarusian, yeah.
Belarusian, thank you. Values is that we've also seen the Trump administration, they pushed forward anti-woke AI approach to things. Did that predate, like which came first? What's the chicken and the egg there? Did the U.S. sort of act first on that, or did other countries act first?
Well, we're certainly seeing, this has been the case for a long time around the world. And so it's been the case that the Chinese government, even when they were talking about internet sovereignty, this is what they were talking about, was that we need to be able to uphold our own values and interests. And that's going back to the founding of the international human rights system, is to say that human rights itself goes against the national interests or a particular culture, whatever it might be. And so that's really the purpose of Freedom House, is to show the universality of human rights and the fact that this is not about one country or culture. It's actually just core fundamental freedoms, freedom of expression, privacy that need to be upheld, whatever the technology is.
Okay, thank you. Caitlin, Adrian talked about the idea of de-risking. You hear about it a lot in this space, right? We're taking an approach to technology that minimizes countries' risks in the world. What is the actual risk? You've been in the rooms where these conversations have been had. What are people so worried about with the more global approach to an AI ecosystem?
I think it goes back to what Kelly talked about up front about the idea of potential backdoors or accesses into tech stacks from certain countries and what that might do to either manipulate data or actually just to take data, I mean, for both disruption and espionage purpose. And I think that there is concern in some countries around those ideas. If the vast majority of the technology underpinning artificial intelligence is from, let's just say, the US or China, then there's some of these questions come up around how do we have some trust in the technology that we're doing. And we talked about at the top of this conversation about the definition for what is sovereign AI. I think we can have similar conversation around what is trust in technology. Everybody has a different view of what that may be. Now, in other technologies like 5G, there were communities of practice and countries that came together to define what they meant by trust in that technology. The European Union's 5G toolbox being a good example of this, where they defined what they meant with governance and cybersecurity and controls and the technical controls, not controls over the populace. And I think that's one of the things that is kind of missing right now in the conversation around sovereign AI is if we're going to talk about trust in a technology stack, what does that actually mean? Because I might have a view of that. I'm looking at the folks in the room. My guess is we don't have the exact same view because we haven't talked about it. We use these buzzwords a lot without definition. And God knows I'm a mother of 3 tween children, and I can tell you every day I am questioning what the heck does that word mean that you just said, right? Like I could be using the exact same word as my child, and I clearly have a different definition of what an uncle is, an unk versus I'm unk. I'm learning these things. And I think what we need to do is start opening up the dialogue and start defining what some of these terms mean. Now we're seeing interesting, moves in this space. A couple weeks ago, France put out its national cybersecurity strategy, and I couldn't help but notice, but pillar number 4 in the strategy, and I'm going to read this specifically. Pillar number 4 of the French national cybersecurity strategy says, maintaining control over the security of our digital foundations. To me, that sounds a little bit like what we're talking about here with sovereign AI, the control over the tech stack, the control over the models, the control over the output of what does that actually, how does this technology underpin our society? And as we're talking about AI really driving things, everything from transportation to healthcare to electricity, having conversations around this, what this means is really important before we get so far down the road that we start pointing at each other and saying, well, you're not trustworthy, or you can't be here, without laying the ground rules up front. I think in some other technologies like 5G, we got to the table late.
in defining what we meant by trust and security. And I think I would like to be Pollyanna here. That is a reference my children don't understand, but Pollyanna, looking glass half full and thinking we still have the opportunity to define trust and security in AI as countries are building out their strategies and their approach, so we can have a common definition and lexicon, please, for the love of God.
Is that defining trust in AI, is it going to be easier or harder than defining trust in 5G?
I think it's going to be harder because the tech stack is so diversified. We're talking about everything from data centers to cloud hyperscalers to the models themselves. And I think every part of the stack needs to have a conversation around what does this mean? And this gets to, I'm talking about a common lexicon. What's another way to say that? Standards. Right?
You stole my question.
Sorry.
I can't resist it. Just very briefly follow up, who defines trust then? What's the forum? What's the process?
Yeah, I would like to think that we could get to an international forum to do that. You see some places where this is starting to pop up. The State Department stood up Pax Silica in the last month to talk about trusted supply chain and ecosystem around artificial intelligence. I think that's a place where some of these definitions and concepts could be defined right now. There's 8 countries in that conversation. It's an interesting swath of countries. It's the U.S., the U.K., Israel, Greece, UAE, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia. I think I got that right. If anybody's counting, I may have missed somebody. I apologize. But I think having some of these fora stood up to talk about this and to set the standards, set those definitions where we can all point to that and say, this is what I mean, is extremely important before we end up in, how many of you guys lived through the data localization pain of like 5 to 10. So I was in finance at that time in an international company doing cybersecurity compliance. Yeah. My experience of, it was the loudest voice in the room as those laws were being stood up and people didn't really understand yet what the outcomes of those laws would mean. And you started to see them shift. Well, we didn't mean that. We didn't mean that you couldn't actually move any data for a financial transaction across borders. We didn't mean that part. And then you saw this kind of, the loudest voice up first, you saw some people pulling back, and then you got to really, in the end, just having to be able to demonstrate that you had control and ability to actually and by control I mean cybersecurity controls, data protection controls around your operations. And I don't think we've really defined even that part yet for artificial intelligence as we think about what this means in the US, in Japan, in Rwanda.
Can I jump in on that actually? Because this, I think, is something where sometimes people outside of these technical and very nerdy fields don't necessarily understand the significance of some of the things that are at stake here. Even determining where we will make this definition, that is a struggle because that will determine who leads it. So like right now, China very much wants this conversation to be held in the ITU because they have a lot more influence in that. We want it to be somewhere else, although not anymore because we've pulled back from some of the bodies where we would have had it, where we had more influence. And so even just deciding where will we have this conversation already has predetermined the pool of who can be the winner that comes out of it. And that's why there's all this wrangling over the semantics and the forum and the people at the table, is because that's where we actually get the work done. And then we sit down and we hammer out some very vague definition. The definition itself also, who's in charge of it matters. I think one of the clearest examples of this is the definition of lethal autonomous weapons systems laws. China was very upfront and proactive about forming a definition for this and wanting there to be legislation around it, and everyone was like, wow, look, they want to be so responsible. Well, they crafted the definition to essentially exclude most of the lethal autonomous weapons systems that they would produce. And so they could have this very like, oh, look, we're leading on ethics and safety, but in reality, they were setting up a system where they would be privileged over all other nations. That's that's what's at stake here. It's these boring measurements and standards and definitions. There's a reason NIST has such a boring name and is so important. It's because standards are actually where we determine power, and everything that comes after that is just flowing from what we've already decided by the standard. And it gets very complicated very quickly.
Excellent. So, Morgan, I hope you didn't take offense to Kelly calling standards boring.
Thanks.
No, your organization spent a lot of time thinking through technology standards. What are the role does standards play? Sort of nuts and bolts in very, very simple terms for some of us who are new to this topic. What role is it going to play in AI development and sovereignty?
I mean, the basic way, and you've heard it from my three excellent panelists, the reality is almost everything in your life that you do today is governed by standards. When you plugged your toaster in this morning, the shape of the plug you used is a standard. The wire that you plugged is a standard. When you use an Ethernet cable, it's got a little word on it, tells you the standards. But that also applies in software and hardware and in technology stacks. And they are set up by acronym soup of standards agencies, IEEE. I serve on the board of another one, LES, SDO. There's ETSI that does Europe. There's IEEE. We're all overseen by ANSI. There is this huge panoply of standards bodies that are, in theory, technical. Right? They come together with a bunch of nerds to talk about definitions and rules and scope. And inside of that space, we make essentially glossaries of terms, right, of what these things mean. And that dictates the next steps forward. What's become super interesting in AI is that while we have 1,200 pieces of legislation introduced in America on AI, you also have Europe with an AI law. And the one common thing between Europe's AI law, Brazil's attempts, the United States laws is nobody has any idea what AI is. And what's happening, especially with Europe's AI Act, is they passed it, and now we're all sitting around in meetings and saying, what did you mean? And increasingly what's happening is they're saying, well, what do the standards bodies say? What definitions is ETSI, which is the primary European standard body, what are they talking about when they talk about AI? And by the way, these standards include things like at IEEE, the 7000 stack includes a standard for what bias means. Now we think of bias as a negative, but it's actually also can be a positive, meaning when they're talking about cultural norming with sovereign AI, part of that is increasing the bias of how you train it to match your culture. So what you write doesn't look the same. But as Freedom House was pointing out, that can be horribly misused to essentially mistreat minorities or characterize minorities in a country in a horrible way. So IEEE's 7000 block determining the definition of bias might sound really boring, but it's actually really, really critical to how this all works. And there's a second factor that gets into the big geopolitics of all this. For a long time, countries have been playing in the standards body. It's not just engineers. For example, if you go to an IEEE meeting, there may be 50 or 60 engineers from the United States. There will be 500 from China. That's not an exaggeration of scale. They have taken a forward approach to it and said, we need to make sure that our country is well represented at all these standards bodies. The United States takes an approach with standards bodies is that it's just done by companies, and the companies have to, from their budget, choose how many engineers that they send. China has taken the policy that standards are important, so we are going to underwrite the participation in standards by multiple companies. So you'll have this huge imbalance of number of people and engineers at the table. And by the way, I don't think China is being dumb to do that. It's probably a good idea. But they've essentially underwritten the engineering staff that are there. And there's one other part of this that even gets more complex and even more nerdy, is last year, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, 10% of all patents that were filed were on AI. Now, you may say, what does that have to do? Well, pretty much every standard that exists in the world includes a section on what are called standard essential patents. And so, if the patents that are included in that standard are owned by a company in a country, and that company's government has said, we would like the other companies from these other countries not to have access to that international standard, then the patent can become a weapon to exclude. Now, technically, they're supposed to be granted on what are called fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, But in the wild, wild west of international relations, what we're seeing is I can exclude if I don't like your country. I'll say you can't use that international standard. Or if you want to sell that product into this country, you're going to have to abide by my rules. And I can use the patent as a cudgel to prevent your use. And so when I say 10% of all patents filed last year were in AI, those are all moving into the standard space to dictate. So kind of three things we got to think about. Definitions, as she said, where do we do the meeting? Is it at ETSI? Is it at IEEE? Is it at ANSI? Is it at LES? We've got to think about who's at the table, from what countries, from what companies, and from what industries. And third, we have to think about what intellectual property are they pushing into the table, and how do they plan to use that in the future?
Okay, excellent thing. It seems like we have a great group here. People have questions? If I open it up, it's not going to be silent. Okay, I'm sorry, not yet. I'm sorry. I'm going to do one more quick question for everyone, and then I'll open it up. Excellent. So I want to read a small bit of a letter that a group of academics and civil society groups in Canada sent to Prime Minister Carney this fall, pretty much saying we need to decouple from the United States, right? So there was a line saying, we will be hard-pressed to build Canada strong, let alone avoid becoming the 51st state if we surrender more of our digital sovereignty to American tech giants. Is it even possible to have, like, has the ship sailed on international consensus? Like, am I too cynical? The ship has sailed on international consensus on the way we used to think of, let's get together in a room and actually come up with standards and, definitions of trust and that sort of thing. Is the world just sort of moved on that it's not possible to have those agreements?
I think.
I'm sorry. Let's Kelly, and then go. Yeah.
This is so hard. I think one thing is we have a lot of vacancies in our diplomatic apparatus. It's really hard for us to have conversations when half of our ambassador seats are empty. Okay. And so that's one thing that I think we talk a lot about technologists taking their roles as diplomats seriously, because where some of Canada's uncertainty in that letter is expressed as a result of actions our government has taken. Some of it's being expressed as a result of actions that companies headquartered in the U.S. have taken, and those companies haven't really thought about their geopolitical power when they decide things. I think just because they're headquartered here doesn't mean we have any control over them either. They almost exert more influence than many nations do around the world. So I think this is a classic question of diplomacy. Are people misunderstanding what's happening? The intentions of the parties at play. So I don't think that consensus is dead. I don't think that the right people view themselves as needing to be at the table to have the conversation. We should fix that.
Okay, I'm going to actually bounce Adrian, and then we'll go back.
Sure. Well, I think it gets to this particular moment that we're in and some of these broader geopolitical trends about why are we seeing this. And I think that for a long time, the U.S. has been, let's say, leveraging, or some would say weaponizing, the interdependence of the global system in order to fight for what's right in some cases. And I think that's where you would have, for sanctions, for example, against bad actors in the international system. I mean, that's an incredible power that the U.S. has always had. And we have seen the likes of China, Russia, Iran, and others find ways to build up their own resilience against the United States, leveraging the system to, in some cases, defend human rights. What I think a lot of people did not expect was the US government to be weaponizing that interdependence against other democracies. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting to see how what is going to happen, and are the likes of Canada or the European Union going to go in the same direction that China, Russia, or Iran went in terms of creating their own, let's say, self-sustainable country. And that, I think China, nobody has done it perhaps better than China, but I would say Iran is the sort of sneaky, and you see this recently with the protests that happened in Iran where they shut off the internet in order to prevent information from going out and also prevent information from being spread around the country. So it has this impact on human rights locally. What is going to be interesting is whether that's even possible. And I think right now, so much of the AI stack is centralized, whether you're looking at semiconductors, whether you're looking at compute capacity or the location of rare earths. And so I think that, I hope at least, that this current moment is temporary, where the likes of Canada, I think it's totally fair and we can understand why Europeans, for example, are insisting on this term strategic autonomy, which is essentially fighting for self-determination. And ultimately, that's what the international system is built for, is respecting the rights of self-determination that every people has. But I'm hopeful that, at least to answer your question, that this is just a temporary moment, that what we need to do and what people are going to realize is that there isn't actually total self-sufficiency. We can't go back to a world of complete autarky where you are totally self-reliant economically or whatever it might be. And so that we will have to, I think we're going through a disruption right now. I do hope that in the coming years things will settle and we will continue to appreciate why alliances are important, why strategic collaboration is important. I mean, there's no coincidence that a couple of years ago when the White House released its own cyberspace policy, it was called digital solidarity. And that was the way to counter the narratives that were coming from authoritarian countries around digital sovereignty. So I think we need to get back to that. We need to get back to the type of, thinking about trust, thinking about collaboration, because ultimately this is an interconnected world. Whatever happens in other countries is going to impact us here. And so that's why I think it's really important that we are not, let's say, burning all bridges and making sure that we actually do have partners and we can work with them to counter a lot of the challenges that are transnational in nature.
I want to actually be the one to have good news, and I'm going to hand it to you. I'm giving you a statement. I'm going to do that. I actually think that there is hope for international, in large part because of small businesses. And the reason I say this is, if I have 1,000 potential customers, I have a hobby. If I have 100,000 potential customers, I have a business. And so a lot of small businesses need an international scope to actually be relevant. And so when digital sovereignty gets so tight that I can only serve the audience in my country or my neighborhood, my product is moribund. I don't have any chance for growth. So my ability to fill a need that has users around the world, or at least in large areas, becomes very powerful. And so for me, the hope of getting along will be because people will want those products. And there is a pretty interesting example of that, back to standards, is China actually played around with this idea from a national security perspective with something called WAPI, right? So we all use Wi-Fi, but there was a time that China proposed a different standard and mandated that all products sold within China had WAPI in it, and as apart from Wi-Fi, 802.11b for those who play at home, and it failed. Why? Because the Chinese audience liked the products that were coming out from around the world that had Wi-Fi in it, 802.11b, and by the way, they're being made in China as well. And so there was access to them, they were better quality, they had a bigger audience, and they helped drive a lot of small businesses to be successful. And I know that gets into the national security parts of how that works.
And I think combining what you just said about businesses really helping to kind of shape some of these conversations and the consumer helping to shape the conversation. I'm going to go back to what Kelly said here. I think we can look at diplomats in the international community a little bit differently than we have in the past and recognize that companies play a big role in those conversations. If I'm a big transnational organization, company, I can, the compliance complexity of having to do business in however many countries around the world, each with its own approach to AI rules and regulations, it is going to, one, stifle innovation because I can't train my models cross-border. I mean, would I even train a language model in multiple languages? Trying to think through all of these things, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the business community for this to be like a conversation of we need to have multiple different standards. You cannot grow. You cannot sustain a business in that way. So I would say in the conversation around can we get to consensus, I would say the business and the private sector plays a huge role in how we can get there. I'm jokingly saying that maybe every company has an AI enterprise roadmap also needs to have a national security planner with them. But I'm not actually joking. I think you should have folks who understand the geopolitical aspects and help have those conversations with the C-suite as you're developing your strategies so that you can identify where are those areas of friction that you should engage in. Things like standards bodies. They're not just for nerds, they're for all of us too. And really where should they use the power of their purse? We talk a lot about at least in the previous administration, we talked a lot about the power of the government purse to shape technology through the government purchasing power. But you know what? I, with, again, those 3 tweens at home, purchase a lot of technology. And I think that I should have some say in this too. And I think when we talk about what diplomacy looks like in the 21st century, it doesn't look like it did 25 years ago. Diplomats look different. They're not necessarily all, going through the foreign service. They are in your boardrooms, They really are. And I think that's where I have some, optimism that we can get to consensus and some approach to how this works, because it really affects all of us.
Okay. We're going to do questions, conversation. If we could keep questions crisp and answers crisp so we can get through a bunch. If you want to, obviously continue conversations after. That. So let's just start over here, right up front.
I'm good at a concise.
And I'm sorry, name, affiliation if relevant, and again, concision.
Hi, I'm Brooke Tanner with the Brookings Institution. I will shamelessly plug our Is AI Sovereignty Possible report coming out next week. But I love what you said about the definitional clarity, Caitlin. And in the spirit of that, I'm wondering, it seems like there are 2 concepts, broad categories brought up. A, the defensive resilience conversation on the physical infrastructure, like we need to reduce reliance on China, maybe US. And then the second, which Adrian, maybe you brought in, of like countries building representative applications, maybe even models like India, to increase access or representation or deployment in their countries. And these seem like different motivations and different answers to different problems, but we're all looping them in this term of AI sovereignty, which maybe is just because it's a fun buzzword. But I'm wondering if you see those as 2 distinct buckets, or if there are ways we can kind of like splice AI sovereignty to make it a more tackleable policy challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go first? Or
You can go ahead, please.
Oh, she called me out first. To be honest, and maybe this is just the way my brain is wired, I kind of see them as 2 different things. When it comes to the digital, when we talked about the infrastructure sovereignty, I think a lot of that goes back to COVID-19 and the realization of what our supply chains actually look like, and the fact when they were not moving, what that meant to economies. And I think that, it's not just AI shaping this conversation about de-risking and about, having some control over the digital infrastructure that drives everyday life in communities. I think COVID-19 was the first kind of like aha moment on that. And I think artificial intelligence was the second. And so we're seeing a confluence of that, and people realizing, well, if there's a potential for disruption, I need to have a little bit more control over that. And how do I do that? I do that by trying to kind of like insource my supply chains and have more control over them. And so that's the way I think about the infrastructure of the conversation around sovereign AI. And I think on the
I'll even take it a little bit further, and thanks for the question. I'm looking forward to the report. I would bring it back even to 2013 and even to 2016 and beyond, where I think around the world, a lot of people have lost faith in the technology that they use, the different platforms that they use, and their ability to control some of the negative externalities that have come from those platforms. I think when you look at the ways that they have contributed to offline harms, in a number, and in some cases even genocide, I think that's where a lot of the drive towards, a lot of the skepticism towards some of these governance structures comes from. And so I think there, it's interesting to add a third element to it, which is about these good faith efforts to actually solve real problems coming from technology and technology policies. But I do think it's important to separate these things because, and as we were alluding to with data localization, it's not necessarily where the data is stored physically. It's actually about what are the protections on how the data is stored. And so a lot of these issues, you're absolutely right that if it's about building applications that are more tailored to solving local problems, that's really a great thing. But then the question becomes, do you need to have physical control in order to accomplish that or not?
I'm gonna just say, so we can create some difference, I'm gonna disagree with her just a little bit in this idea of insourcing. I actually think building greater resiliency is better. I think what we learned in the supply chain was you can cut it too close to the bone. And so what worries me about if we have public policy that aims towards insourcing, it gets very insular. And again, from a small business perspective, my perspective is I want more customers in more places that have more access to my products. So I want to be very careful that our public policy doesn't say, well, insourcing is the only answer. I think it needs to be greater resiliency, which means build your domestic.
Multiple vendors.
Yeah.
Yes, I was sorry, I was not clear. I'm not necessarily for insourcing.
Okay, good.
I am I'm a former emergency manager who fully believes in having more than one supplier, and because when that is cut off, what do you back up to? If your primary is there, what's your fallback? But I think what happened in a lot of places, people didn't have that fallback. Yeah.
I was trying to create controversy.
Yes.
You know, we didn't-
Sorry.
Actually, I'll poke at that. We did see Tim Cook in the Oval Office in the summer talking about building an end-to-end silicon supply chain complete within the United States. Was that misguided?
I think when you run a multi-trillion-dollar company, it's possible to build an end-to-end supply chain.
Okay.
However,
The rest of us are.
Yeah, well, not just the rest of us. I actually think that what's important is that we have an end-to-end supply chain that has access points for small businesses to build products on top of it. I don't want just one end-to-end supply chain. I like there being more than one.
Can I do a quick hit on one part of her question? You asked, can we merge these two questions? I think where the infrastructure question merges with this representative technology question is on the layer of, can you build something, or do you have to have your access to something for you be mediated by a large lab? And so I think that's when the infrastructure question is important. Do you have the compute and the open source model and the data management to be able to build an Indic language LLM or a tribal language LLM? You know, there's not a lot of trust among Native American tribes in the US in the big labs. They're not willing to work with them, but they deserve to have an AI model that's tailored to their needs. I think that is the point where that does become one single conversation.
That's hard, though, from the perspective, as an Alaskan, I will tell you that there are cultural problems with that.
Yes.
Right? Inuit, Gwich'en, their version of sharing information is not one that is highly compatible with the idea of just spilling everything to an LLM. There are cultural components to how that works.
Is it on? Okay. Charles Sung, Washingtonian, and also inventor of Universal Computing Interface Architecture and founder and the CEO of Alliance for Universal Computing, among many other titles. But that's enough for me. But a very quick question for every member of the panel. I hope you can answer this question very clearly. Trying to ask that one earlier, the keynote did not get a chance. Very simple question. I'm a veteran of this conference, annual one. So we are talking about the internet. Now we are talking about AI. A very simple question for each one of you. Is AI bigger than the internet? If so, why?
Is AI bigger than the internet?
Which is a claim made by many big wigs from the West Coast, including some big wigs from Google, among many others.
Bigger in significance? World-changing?
Well, they made a claim saying that AI is bigger than the internet. So I want every member of the panel to answer that question.
Kelly, you're up first.
Oh man, you guys always give me the hard ones first.
Okay, I would take it to go.
I think in terms of changing the way that we engage with information in the world, I guess I would say they're about on par. But we're in such a bubble of, and I don't use that word lightly, but in terms of, we're trying to throw AI at everything right now, and we're gonna find out where it actually fits in our lives. But I do think it'll fundamentally be a version shift of, I used to do my work this way, now I do it this way, and that bears very little resemblance. The same as I used to do research in the library, now I do it on a computer. So I guess I would equate them. That's maybe a cop-out.
So I'll say no, because I think we have almost a biblical begat problem, right? It would be saying, is the printing press bigger than the internet? Well, you don't have the internet without the printing press. You don't have AI without the internet. You don't have, I mean, all of these are begats. It's like reading the Old Testament. We have to go through the begats to get to the AI. Do I think its impact on society is going to be as big? I think that's an open question, but I don't think it's bigger because you can't do one without the other. And I would say where today's AI is as reliant on the decision to invent a printing press as it is for the first Cat5 cable.
Ditto what he said. There, I was being, you asked for a quick answer. Agreed.
All I heard was somebody said baguettes, and so I'm looking for where the baguettes are. But I would take it. I'm gonna answer that question in this way. I worry that AI is bigger than the free and open internet. And so that what we're going to see is that AI is going to almost, like our problems or our concerns around AI are going to consume how we think about the global internet, and if we think about the internet as connecting people all around the world, we might get to a time where we don't actually need the internet because it's just machines talking to each other. And so what are they working for? And then where does that leave all of us?
All right.
Well, so Morgan get A plus.
You're gonna go right behind you.
If you have a follow-up, please connect with our panel after the Q&A.
We're gonna go in the tire thing.
Thank you. My name is Abhishek, and I'm an engineer as well as a lawyer. So there has been some recent news that some companies are going to put data centers into the space. So my question is...
Into outer space?
Into outer
Outer
space.
outer
We're
space.
putting them on the moon, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what kind of privacy concerns or regulatory concerns are there if the data center is registered in a country which is not signatory to the Outer Space Treaty or the Space Liability Convention?
These would be satellite data center, like they're orbiting.
Yes.
Well, there's satellite, and then there was somebody
on the moon.
On the moon was also suggested using solar energy to power.
All right, I got to write a story about.
We have standards on some of that stuff. That exists. There are standards around treaties on data and data transportation in which layer. So yeah.
And which entities have talked about this so far? Just for those of us who have.
My question was specifically about if the data center is registered in a country which is not signatory to the Outer Space Treaty or the Space Liability Convention.
Right. So that's a place where you can actually use standards. Meaning that if there's an ANSI-approved standard that says what are the rules by which you are governing your privacy terms, then vendors can basically say, it doesn't matter if you subscribe to the space treaty. If you say I will buy products that don't comply with IEEE's 1234.204 policy, then you don't buy a product. So you can actually use standards to kind of circumvent that.
To drive what you expect your partners
exactly the right word.
To do. And so that's where, again, I'm going to talk about companies as diplomats, but in this case, really contractual arrangements is where some of this comes in place. So you're in a country that hasn't signed on to a treaty. Well, you're another company. I'm going to tell you in my terms and conditions of my contract with you what I expect of you and how you handle data and how you handle bias, everything that we've been talking about. I can put that in my terms and contract. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I want to be very clear. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you the lawyers at my company could write that. So.
My name's Silas James. I'm a student at American. And my question concerns something you touched on earlier with American state power through the internet companies. I know that for a long time, American companies relied on a narrative of internet freedom, and that's changed a lot recently with both politicians and companies talking about American AI dominance. I spoke with a employee at an AI firm earlier that said that rhetoric is hurting American companies' market shares abroad. And I would imagine that if it's hurting their market shares, that's also hurting the internationalized state power of America. So I'm curious on if you all think that statement is true and how companies are navigating that.
What rhetoric exactly? That
American dominance.
Oh, okay.
And so I guess this is where you would probably have noticed I didn't talk about dominance at all while I was up here. I talked about trust and the fact that we really need to define what that means. That's the way I look at things is, probably because of I worked in issues around 5G and telecom, and the parties to that were not U.S. companies, and some of them were not U.S. companies. Some of the leaders in that space were European companies, and so I purposely use terms like trust. I can't speak for this administration because I'm not in this administration, but this is one of those reasons why I think we have to. I'm going to go back to words have meaning, and we need to make sure that when we're having conversations with countries around the world that the words, I mean, even if you look at Pax Silica, the recent, U.S.-led approach to security and supply chain, I don't think you see the word dominance in the charter of that. I think I see the word trust. And so I like, that's what I go back to.
You do, I mean, they do present it as winning the AI race.
They do, but through trust. I mean, you hear the winning the race a lot from a lot of different administrations. You hear winning. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
so I hear military.
I'm curious what you think about the sort of the intersection of the U.S. dominance and
yeah. Well, I think that listen, even from the early days of the global internet, you had a lot of examples of American tech giants who were working in authoritarian countries, who were building up their surveillance capacity, their censorship capacity, a lot of great investigative reporting on that. And if the question is sort of, does AI sovereignty harm U.S. companies? I'm not really worried about that because, also because the companies are going to be fine. Right now, what you see is a lot of companies selling sovereignty as a service. And so they're going to, the largest U.S. companies are going to Europe and to other countries and say, oh, you want sovereign AI? We can build that for you as a U.S. company. So that sort of shows the hypocrisy of the term AI sovereignty. If it is all just U.S. companies who are building something for you, it gets really complicated.
Anyone else? Nope. Okay, we're going to start Do you have a very quick question? Okay, very quick, and then we're going to wrap up. Sorry, I apologize.
Hi, I'm Lalantika, a student at Georgetown Law. My question is simply, when we're talking about sovereign AI and governance, are consumers a legitimate interest, or are they just a pawn in the greater wars between business interests and state power and dominance?
Well, as the business guy here, I would say, without consumers, we're not in business. So consumers are ultimately the major player. To her use of the word trust, that's the thing, right? If my customer doesn't trust me, they don't buy my product. And so within the bounds of the scope that we have available, the consumer is a major part of the equation. I think the area where governments are going to have to get on top of it, it isn't things like DMA and AI Act in Europe or similar ones in Japan and around the world. It's actually getting back to a harms theory, which is somebody being unfair? Are they being deceptive? Are they lying? Are they cheating? Are they doing acts that have a harm, and it can be reputational harm as well, to a consumer? Because I think that leads to a visceral feeling of saying, I'm not going to do business with that company anymore, right? So if you detach it from the harm, and the consumer can't see they're part of it, then it feels ephemeral. If you're like, this guy won't let me buy a house because the way that his model is trained has determined that people of my skin color or my ethnic background can't buy houses, that's an identifiable problem that you can get. And I think that countries have to look at how are there identifiable harms. The FTC used to really kind of focus on unfair and deceptive trade practices, UDAP, Section 5. I think that that's the way the consumer has to be part of it, because you're going to have to attach it to a harm. Otherwise, it's too ephemeral.
Thank you. Quickly, yeah.
Just to, I think it's a great question, and it's something where, one thing that I heard at a tech conference was somebody saying, this is a VC saying, well, we can't have tight regulations on AI because China's going to win. And so they gave the example of if somebody's killed from a self-driving car in China, they're not going to stop. So why should we stop? And so we shouldn't hold companies accountable for that. So I think what we should be insisting on, and this is why I really, from my perspective, don't like the term AI sovereignty. It shouldn't actually be about sovereignty. It shouldn't be about an AI race and winning this race for whatever, like what are we racing for? Ultimately, we're racing for a democracy, prosperity, human dignity, human rights. That has to be the center of the race. And if we lose the plot, just because, for its own sake, then I think we all lose. The consumer loses, the citizen loses, and the world loses.
Lightning round to wrap up. I know you guys are going to love this, but if I want to make a prediction in 10 years, I want to sound smart and happy. I want to say in 10 years, AI is going to be completely dominated by American companies and American expectations for AI, or the U.S. is going to be merely a small player in the AI ecosystem. Which one do I say?
You want to start on the row?
Kelly, yeah.
Oh, man. I want to sit in the middle next time. I feel like it's going to end up with where it's kind of the internet, where the internet is American, but not dominated by American values. It's flexible, but I would say that while we may not be the clear frontrunner forever, I think we have kind of shaped the stage already.
So long as we make sure we have access to capital, access to talent, and access to the underpinning infrastructure, then the United States has no reason to fall behind. If we don't do those things, then the answer is no.
I agree. I think in 10 years, you will see U.S. leadership in this space.
I think it'll be what we're seeing in terms of geopolitically of more of a multipolar order, but the U.S. still the leader. And I think that could be a good thing so long as there isn't this confluence of corporate power and government power without bringing in voices from civil society. I think that's going to be really important to make sure that this technology is governed for good.
Okay, thank you so much. I apologize if we didn't get to your questions. I'm sure folks will be willing to speak after the panel. We've talked about Alaska, space satellites, the Bible, baguettes. So thank you, Kelly, Morgan, Adrian, and Caitlin. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for.
Thank you, Nick.